There are men history remembers as monsters. There are men history remembers as heroes. And then there are men who lived so deep inside the grey, who spent so many years serving evil while quietly, carefully, constructing a different story for themselves, that history has never quite decided what to do with them. Karl Wolff is one of those men. He was not the loudest voice in the room. He was not the one whose name children would one day learn in school as a symbol of all that went wrong in the 20th century. He was something more elusive, and in many ways more unsettling. He was the man behind the man, the one who managed schedules and communications and logistics and personal relationships at the very center of the most destructive organization Europe had ever produced. He wore the black uniform. He carried the rank. He attended the meetings. He signed the letters. And for years, for most of the war, he knew exactly what those letters meant. And yet, by the time the guns fell silent in the spring of 1945, Karl Wolff was being quietly celebrated in certain Allied intelligence circles as a man who had helped bring the war in Italy to an earlier close, a man who had negotiated in secret, a man who had, if you believed his version of events, used whatever influence he possessed to spare lives when the machinery around him was designed only to destroy them. Two things, apparently, can be true at once. The question is, which truth carries more weight? Tonight, or this morning, or whatever quiet hour you have chosen to set aside the noise of the day and let your mind drift somewhere else, we are going to follow this man across the full arc of his life, from a comfortable middle-class home in Darmstadt, in the state of Hesse, at the turn of the 20th century, through the trenches of the First World War and the wreckage that followed, through the seductive rise of a political movement that promised order and offered belonging, through the corridors of SS power, where Wolff stood at Heinrich Himmler's shoulder for more than a decade, managing the empire that Himmler built, through the slow moral erosion that comes with proximity to atrocity, and then, in the final years, through the secret meetings in Swiss drawing rooms where Wolff tried to write a different ending for himself, for his forces, and perhaps, in his own telling, for the people of northern Italy. This is the entire history of Karl Wolff. It is not a comfortable story. It was never meant to be. But it is a deeply human one, and that, perhaps, is precisely why it matters. Because the easiest thing in the world is to look at a man in a black uniform and see only the uniform. The harder thing, the more important thing, is to ask how an apparently ordinary person, born into an apparently ordinary family, with apparently ordinary ambitions, ends up at the center of history's darkest chapter, and then to ask whether anything he did at the end changes the accounting. We will not answer that question for you tonight. That would be too easy, and frankly too dishonest. What we will do is give you everything: the rise, the complicity, the negotiations, the reckoning, and the long decades afterward, when Wolff lived in a kind of uneasy freedom that many felt he had not earned. You will have all the pieces. The conclusion is yours to reach. Before we begin, if you have found your way to this documentary, if this kind of slow, careful, late-night history is the thing that helps you find rest, then consider joining this community of listeners who prefer their history honest and their nights unhurried. There is a great deal more where this comes from, and subscribing means none of it passes you by. Now settle in. Find your comfortable position. Let the world outside do whatever it needs to do. For the next several hours, you are here, and we are going to take our time. Because Karl Wolff's story deserves time, not out of respect for the man. That is a judgment we leave entirely to you, but because the story itself is genuinely complex, and complexity deserves space. We live in an age that wants its historical figures sorted quickly into columns: villain or victim, monster or hero, guilty or innocent. Wolff resists every column. He slips between them with the same careful ease he used to navigate the corridors of power in Berlin, in Rome, in Verona, in Zurich. He was charming, by almost every account, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of smooth social intelligence that made him invaluable in rooms where relationships mattered as much as orders. Himmler, who was by nature awkward and humorless and obsessive, found in Wolff something he himself could not provide: a face for the SS that did not frighten civilian officials, foreign dignitaries, or even, occasionally, his own subordinates. Wolff was the warmth in a cold organization, the social glue, the man you sent to a meeting when you needed someone the other side might actually listen to. That skill, that particular talent for being liked, for being trusted, for being seen as reasonable, would serve Wolff in the second half of the war in ways no one in Berlin fully anticipated, including Wolff himself. Italy changed him. Or perhaps Italy revealed him. Perhaps the man who emerges in 1943 and 44 and 45, quietly reaching out to American intelligence officers, sitting in discreet Swiss apartments and talking about surrender terms. Perhaps that man was always there, buried under years of loyalty and ambition, and the daily business of not looking too closely at what he was a part of. Or perhaps it was simpler and less flattering than that. Perhaps a man who had spent his whole life reading the room had simply read the room one final time, recognized which way the war was going, and made a calculation. Both interpretations are supportable. Neither is fully satisfying. That is the point. We begin where all lives begin, not in uniform, not in power, not in the meeting rooms of a collapsing empire, but in the quiet, ordinary world of a boy growing up in provincial Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. A boy who would go to war too young, return to a country that had lost its shape, and find, as so many of his generation found, that the chaos of those years left a space inside him that something was going to fill eventually. It was filled by the wrong thing. Whether anything he did afterward was enough to matter, that is the question that has followed Karl Wolff for 4 decades beyond his death. Let us find out together. There is a city in the German state of Hesse that sits quietly along the Rhine plain, neither grand enough to demand the world's attention, nor small enough to be forgotten entirely. Darmstadt was, at the turn of the 20th century, a city of culture and contradiction, a ducal seat that had outlived its duchy, a place of Art Nouveau ambition and middle-class propriety pressed up against each other on cobbled streets. The Grand Ducal Court had given Darmstadt a certain borrowed elegance, and its citizens carried themselves accordingly, with that particular German bourgeois confidence that mistook refinement for righteousness. Into this world, on the 13th of May, 1896, Karl Friedrich Otto Wolff was born. He entered a Germany still drunk on the victory of 1871, still wearing the flush of a new empire, still certain that order and discipline were the natural architecture of civilized life. His parents were respectable people, educated, proper, attentive to appearances in the way that the German middle class had perfected across generations. The house he grew up in was not wealthy in the manner of industrialists or landowners, but it was comfortable, and comfort, in that era, carried its own form of pressure. From his earliest years, those who knew young Karl Wolff remarked on something particular about him, a quality that sat somewhere between charm and calculation. He was attentive without being servile, confident without being loud. He understood, almost instinctively, how rooms worked, how people arranged themselves around authority, and how a young man with no title and limited fortune might still climb if he observed carefully enough. These are not extraordinary gifts, but in combination they are powerful ones, and in the social world of Wilhelmine Germany, they were the tools with which a certain kind of man could construct a remarkable career. He was bright in school, diligent in the way that pleases teachers without threatening them. He was also physically presentable, tall, straight-backed, with the sort of bearing that Germans of that period associated with good breeding, regardless of whether the breeding was actually there. The image mattered enormously in that world. Karl Wolff understood this before he had words for the understanding. The Germany of his childhood was a country performing certainty it did not entirely possess. Emperor Wilhelm II sat at its center, mercurial and overreaching, pulling Europe toward dangers that most citizens could not yet imagine. The army was the great institution of national life, admired, glorified, dressed in color and ceremony, that made sacrifice look like spectacle. For young men of Wolff's generation, the military was not simply a career option, it was the central metaphor through which manhood was defined. To serve was to belong to something larger than oneself, and belonging, the hunger for it, was a force that shaped entire generations in ways they rarely examined directly. Wolff absorbed all of this. The parades, the drilling of local garrison troops through the streets, the smell of leather and polished brass. These were the textures of his childhood, and they left marks that would not fade. When the summer of 1914 arrived, it arrived with the particular violence of things that have been building for too long. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, in late June of that year, set in motion the machinery that consumed a continent. Wolff was 17 years old when the war began, young enough that the initial fever of enthusiasm caught him fully, old enough that he could see himself as a participant rather than a bystander. He entered military service as the war unfolded, joining the German forces with the specific kind of fervor that belongs to those who have been told since birth that duty is its own reward. He served on the Western Front, moving through the particular hell that phrase contained, the mud, the stalemate, the grinding attrition of industrial warfare that no amount of patriotic education had prepared anyone for. He was wounded in action, a detail that would matter later, not because wounds confer wisdom, but because they confer credibility, and Wolff was always attentive to the things that conferred credibility. He survived the war. Millions did not. By the time the armistice came in November of 1918, Germany had lost more than 2 million soldiers killed, with many more hundreds of thousands wounded or missing. The country that emerged from that catastrophe was barely recognizable as the confident empire that had marched into Belgium 4 years earlier. The Kaiser fled, the monarchy collapsed. What replaced it was the Weimar Republic, born in defeat, immediately burdened with the punishing terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and viewed by large portions of the German public not as a liberation, but as a humiliation. Wolff returned from the front into this fractured country, still a young man by any calculation, carrying the particular bewilderment of those who had been promised meaning and received only wreckage. He was 22 years old. The world he had been trained to inhabit no longer existed. The Weimar years were disorienting in ways that are difficult to convey from a distance. For men of Wolff's background and temperament, middle class, military formed, accustomed to clear hierarchies and stable expectations, the 1920s were not the era of cultural liberation they appear to be in retrospect. They were years of inflation that wiped out savings overnight, of political street violence between factions whose ideological differences were secondary to their mutual hunger for power. of constant uncertainty about whether the institutions of ordinary life could be trusted to hold. Wolff, like many veterans of his generation, found himself adrift in the civilian economy. He worked in business for a period, moving through positions that required his natural organizational competence, but offered nothing that satisfied the deeper need he carried, the need to belong to something with clear purpose, clear hierarchy, clear enemies. This was the soil in which the politics of the coming decade would take root, and it was extraordinarily fertile. What distinguished Wolff from the more immediately violent men of his generation was the quality of his self-control. He was not a brawler. He was not a street agitator. He did not have the raw ideological fervor that drove men directly toward the extremes of the political spectrum in those years. His path toward the far right was more measured, more deliberate, the product of calculation as much as conviction. He had watched the chaos of the early Weimar years with the particular frustration of someone who believed, at a fundamental level, that order was the natural condition of things and that disorder represented failure, moral failure, political failure, civilizational failure. This belief was not unique to him, it was widespread, and it was the psychological foundation on which movements like the National Socialists built their earliest architecture of appeal. He also carried, through these years, the social anxiety that was so common among his class. The German-educated middle class had staked its identity on a specific vision of cultivated respectability, and the upheavals of the 1920s threatened that identity from multiple directions simultaneously. Economic ruin stripped away the material foundations of bourgeois dignity. Political chaos stripped away the assumption that proper, decent people governed such affairs. Cultural change brought with it styles and attitudes that men like Wolff experienced as alien provocations rather than expressions of human freedom. The resentments that accumulated during these years were real, even if the conclusions drawn from them were catastrophic. Wolff was not immune to any of this. He was, in many ways, a precise product of it. There is something important to understand about the men who eventually rose to senior positions within the structures of the Third Reich, and it is this. Most of them were not exceptional in their pathology. They were ordinary in their ambitions, ordinary in their insecurities, ordinary in their hunger for order and significance. What made them extraordinary, in the terrible sense, was the particular moment in history they inhabited, the particular institutional structures that channeled their ordinary qualities toward extraordinary consequences. Karl Wolff, standing in the wreckage of post-war Germany in his mid-20s, was not yet a figure of any significance. He was a veteran, a former officer, a man of some intelligence and considerable social skill, searching for the current that would carry him somewhere meaningful. The current was already forming. It would take a few more years before it ran strong enough to take him with it. By the late 1920s, the political temperature of Germany had risen to levels that made neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves through an already fragile German economy, deepening the desperation that had never fully receded since the armistice. Unemployment climbed to figures that represented not just economic hardship, but social catastrophe. By the early 1930s, millions of German workers had no income, no prospect, and no particular reason to trust that the Weimar system would find solutions it had so conspicuously failed to find before. Into this desperation, the National Socialists projected their message with the precision of people who understood exactly which wounds to press. Wolff was watching, and he was beginning, with the careful deliberateness that would define him, to make his choices. He would not make those choices violently or impulsively. That was never his manner. Instead, He would approach the coming decade the way he appeared to approach most things, with the patience of a man who had learned to observe before committing, to calculate before speaking, to understand the room before deciding where in it to stand. The uniform he would eventually wear was still some years away. The man who would become Himmler's closest aide, who would one day command SS forces across occupied Italy and negotiate in secret with the enemies of the regime he served, was still forming himself in the uncertainty of the early 1930s. But the essential architecture of Karl Wolff, his ambition, his intelligence, his extraordinary capacity to inhabit contradictions without resolving them, was already fully present. Darmstadt had given him his beginning. Germany's catastrophe would give him his stage. The Germany that Karl Wolff returned to after the Great War was not the Germany he had left. The empire was gone. The Kaiser had fled. And in the wreckage of 4 years of industrialized slaughter, a new republic had been born, fragile, contested, and despised almost from the moment of its first breath. For a young man who had believed in the old order, who had grown up in the comfortable certainty of Wilhelmine pride, the sudden collapse felt less like a political event and more like a personal wound. Weimar Germany was a place of extremes, brilliance and squalor, artistic freedom and street violence, economic desperation and cynical profiteering. For veterans returning from the trenches, men who had endured years of mud and death only to find hyperinflation erasing their savings and communist agitators threatening the streets, the Republic felt like an insult dressed up as progress. Wolff was not unique in this bitterness, but he was perhaps more calculating than most in deciding what to do with it. He did not rush toward the extremes immediately. That is worth understanding, because it complicates the easy narrative of a man born for the black uniform. In the early 1920s, Wolff moved through business circles, attempting to rebuild a civilian life in a country that made such rebuilding extraordinarily difficult. He worked in sales and banking, wearing suits rather than uniforms, trying to construct something resembling middle-class stability in a nation where middle-class stability was being systematically destroyed by forces beyond any individual's control. And he watched, month by month and year by year, as inflation ate through savings, as political parties rose and collapsed, as the streets of German cities became arenas for violent contests between left and right. The Republic offered him no particular belonging. Its institutions felt borrowed, its democracy imposed rather than earned. He was searching, in the way that many of his generation searched, for something that felt German in its bones. The early National Socialist movement was, in these years, one voice among many on the fractured German right. It was louder than most, surely more theatrical, and it possessed in Adolf Hitler a speaker of genuinely extraordinary power, a man who could take a room full of disillusioned veterans and working men and make them feel that their grievances were not merely personal but cosmic, that Germany had been stabbed in the back by enemies within, that the nation's humiliation was a crime demanding vengeance and restoration. Wolff encountered this world gradually, through the social networks that connected veterans, nationalist clubs, and the various right-wing formations that competed for the loyalties of disaffected Germans. He was drawn not primarily by ideology in its most radical form, not at least, not yet, but by something more fundamental, the sense of order, of hierarchy, of masculine belonging that these movements offered to men who felt that the Republic had left them stranded. His formal association with National Socialist circles crystallized in the early 1930s as the movement transformed from a fringe party of brawlers and believers into something approaching a mass political phenomenon. The economic catastrophe that followed 1929 had done what years of street violence and political agitation could not. It had broken the Republic's credibility entirely. Unemployment consumed millions of German workers. Banks failed. Respectable families queued for bread. Into this desperation, the Nazi Party poured promises of work, of dignity, of restored national greatness, with a precision and theatrical power that more established parties could not match. Wolff was among those who decided, in these years, that the party was not merely a protest movement, but the shape of Germany's future. Joining was, for him, both a political act and a professional calculation. He was a man who understood institutions, who read power the way a navigator reads weather, and he could see which way the wind was turning. When he put on the SS uniform, he was not entering a purely military organization. The Schutzstaffel had begun as Hitler's personal bodyguard, a small, elite formation defined by personal loyalty rather than conventional military structure. But under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, who had assumed leadership of the organization in the late 1920s, it was becoming something far more ambitious, a racial and political vanguard, a body of men selected not merely for toughness, but for ideological purity, physical conformity to Aryan ideals, and absolute submission to the chain of command that ran upward through Himmler to Hitler himself. It was an organization that dressed its ambitions in the language of ancient Germanic brotherhoods and racial destiny, but functioned, at its administrative core, like a modern bureaucracy. Wolff, with his business experience, his presentable appearance, his social ease among men of education and standing, was precisely the kind of officer the expanding SS needed in the early 1930s. He did not begin at the top, but he rose with a speed that spoke to genuine talent. SS advancement in these years was not purely a matter of ideological fervor. It rewarded competence, organizational skill, and the ability to manage competing demands with discretion. Wolff had all of these. He was articulate where many of his colleagues were blunt. He could move through social settings, speak to businessmen and aristocrats and party officials with equal facility, project an image of calm authority that made superiors comfortable and subordinates compliant. He understood that the SS was not merely a fighting force but a political instrument, and that navigating it required skills that had nothing to do with the parade ground and everything to do with the anteroom, the memorandum, and the carefully worded conversation. He accumulated responsibilities steadily, each role preparing him for the next, each promotion a confirmation that the men above him had noticed what he could do. It was in these years that Wolff began developing the characteristic that would define his entire career, the ability to be present at the center of enormous power without ever making himself the loudest voice in the room. He was not a public figure in the way that other Nazi leaders cultivated public presence. He was not a speaker who worked crowds into frenzy, not a theorist who published pamphlets about racial destiny, not a military man who sought glory on the field. He was something quieter and in many ways more dangerous, an indispensable administrator, a man who made difficult things happen smoothly, who translated the ambitions of his superiors into practical action without embarrassing questions. This quality made him valuable. It also made him, over time, complicit in ways that pure distance might have prevented. His personal presentation became, in these years, a kind of professional instrument. Wolff was tall, fair, athletic in bearing. He looked, in the most literal physical sense, like what the SS wanted its officers to look like. He dressed his uniform with particular care. He was known for his manners, his charm, his ability to make an impression in rooms where impression-making mattered. These were not trivial attributes in an organization that placed genuine importance on appearance, bearing, and the projection of an ideal. But they also served Wolff's own calculations. He understood that in a hierarchical world built on personal loyalty, the man who presented himself well, who could be trusted to represent his superior creditably in difficult company, was the man who would be kept close. He was positioning himself, consciously or otherwise, for exactly the kind of proximity to power that would define the next decade of his life. As the party moved from the margins toward the corridors of actual state authority, as the early 1930s brought electoral success, and then the chancellorship, and then the rapid dismantling of democratic constraints, Wolff moved with it. The transition from a Germany that was merely authoritarian in mood to one that was becoming authoritarian in fact happened with a speed that surprised even many inside the movement. Institutions fell, rivals were silenced, the state apparatus was absorbed and reshaped with a thoroughness that reflected years of careful planning. The SS was central to this transformation, and Wolff was becoming central to the SS. He was no longer simply a regional figure or a mid-ranking administrator. He was being noticed by the men who would determine what the SS would become. The relationship between rank and responsibility in the early SS was not always straightforward. A man could hold a formal position that understated his actual influence, or a title that overstated it. Wolff was developing a form of influence that existed between titles, the influence of the trusted aide, the man who knew what was happening across multiple desks, who could smooth over disagreements before they became confrontations, who understood the personalities of the senior leadership well enough to anticipate what they needed before they asked. This kind of influence was invisible from outside the organization, but very real within it. It was the kind of influence that attached naturally to the man positioned just behind the man with the formal authority, the one who prepared the briefings, managed the correspondence, controlled access, and shaped the information that flowed upward and downward through the hierarchy. By the time the National Socialists had consolidated their grip on the German state, Wolff's trajectory had brought him to the edge of Himmler's immediate circle. He had accumulated the experience, the reputation, and the trusted relationships that made him a natural candidate for what would become the most consequential posting of his life. The black uniform he had put on in the early years of the movement had by now become something different from what it had been at the beginning, more powerful, more feared, more saturated with political meaning and with the particular darkness that the SS would increasingly embody. And Wolff wore it with the same careful composure he brought to everything, projecting competence and loyalty in equal measure, betraying nothing of whatever calculations were running beneath the surface. The road from Darmstadt to the inner sanctum of Nazi power had been longer than it appeared in retrospect. Not a straight line, but a series of choices, each one closing certain doors while opening others. The next door, when it opened, would lead to Himmler himself. There is a particular kind of man who understands power before he holds any of it. He observes the room before entering it. He reads the temperature of a conversation before speaking. He knows which ambitions to display and which to conceal, and he has learned, through long experience or sharp instinct, that the surest path to influence is not to demand it, but to make yourself indispensable to someone who already possesses it. Karl Wolff was that kind of man, and in Heinrich Himmler, he found precisely the figure his particular gifts required. A superior who was brilliant in ideology and organization, but awkward in human contact, who carried enormous authority with a bureaucrat's bearing, and who needed, above all, someone who could translate his vision into elegant social reality. The two men were, in a sense, made for each other, not as equals, never as equals, but as a pairing whose professional chemistry would reshape one of the most feared organizations in modern history. The circumstances of their first substantial encounter are not recorded with the precision of formal diplomatic minutes, but the weight of the relationship that followed speaks to its significance. By the early years of the 1930s, Himmler had already consolidated meaningful control over the SS, transforming it from a bodyguard formation numbering in the hundreds into a growing organization with its own identity, its own mythology, and its own hunger for expansion. What it lacked was the texture of respectability, a polished face to present to the wider Nazi hierarchy and to the German officer class that still viewed the SS with a certain condescension. Wolff, tall and immaculately turned out, with the easy confidence of someone who had navigated Weimar's social currents and survived them, offered precisely that. He looked the part of a senior officer. He spoke the part. He carried himself as though history were already arranging itself in his favor. Himmler noticed. What followed was an appointment that would define the next decade of Wolff's life. He was brought into Himmler's inner circle as personal adjutant, the man who stood between the Reichsführer SS and the world, managing access, filtering information, coordinating correspondence, and ensuring that Himmler's day ran with the kind of frictionless efficiency that high command demands. It was not a glamorous role in the conventional military sense. There were no battlefield commissions attached to it, no medals won in the field. But anyone who understood how power actually functioned inside the Nazi state would have recognized it immediately for what it was, one of the most strategically significant positions in the entire SS. To stand at Himmler's shoulder was to stand at the center of a growing empire. The relationship developed its own internal logic with remarkable speed. Himmler was a man of obsessions, racial theory, Germanic mythology, occult history, agricultural philosophy, the careful breeding of a new European aristocracy. He was also, beneath the cold exterior, a man who craved loyalty with an almost desperate intensity, having grown up unremarkable in a world that rewarded spectacle. Wolff gave him loyalty of a particular quality, visible, reliable, and never threatening. Where Himmler was sometimes stiff in social settings, Wolff charmed. Where Himmler's pronouncements could drift into the abstract, Wolff translated them into the language of practical action. He was never seen to contradict, never seen to diminish, and never seen to position himself as a rival. To the senior figures of the Nazi movement, observing from the outside, Wolff appeared to be the ideal subordinate. Whether this was performance or conviction, or some intertwining of the two that even Wolff himself could no longer distinguish, is a question that would follow him for the rest of his life. His formal title evolved as the organization around him evolved. By the middle years of the 1930s, Wolff had risen to the position of Chief of Personal Staff, a role that gave him oversight of the entire administrative machinery surrounding Himmler's command. This meant that the flow of information into and out of Himmler's office passed through Wolff's hands. Reports from SS commanders in the field, requests from party officials, communications from police apparatus, correspondence with military leadership, all of it moved through a system that Wolff supervised and, to a considerable extent, shaped. He decided what Himmler saw first. He determined the framing of certain problems. He managed the relationships between Himmler and the wider SS leadership with the skill of a diplomat who had never formally studied diplomacy. Power of this kind leaves no clean fingerprints, but it is power nonetheless. His rank advanced accordingly. He moved through the SS hierarchy with a pace that reflected both his usefulness and the accelerating expansion of the organization itself. Promotions came not as rewards for individual heroism, but as recognitions of institutional weight, of the fact that the man holding this position required a rank commensurate with the people he dealt with daily. To negotiate on Himmler's behalf with a senior Wehrmacht general or a minister from the Reich government, Wolff needed standing. He received it. By the mid-1930s, he wore the rank of a senior SS general, a figure of real authority within a structure that was rapidly becoming one of the most powerful in the German state. Yet status brought its own complications. The SS was not a monolith of harmonious ambition. It was a collection of competing personalities, each managing their own domains and casting careful eyes toward their rivals. Men like Reinhard Heydrich occupied the same upper atmosphere of SS power, and Heydrich was a figure of genuine and formidable intelligence, cold-eyed and calculating in ways that Wolff was not. The internal politics of the SS required Wolff to walk a constant line, visible enough to maintain his influence, careful enough not to accumulate enemies whose removal of him would cause Himmler less grief than inconvenience. He navigated this with the same social fluency that had brought him to Himmler's side in the first place. Observers of the time recorded him as a man who was difficult to dislike even when they distrusted him, a quality that is less common than it sounds and considerably more useful. There was also the matter of public representation. As the SS extended its reach through German society, Himmler was increasingly required to interface with elements of German life that required careful handling. The military establishment, the church, the surviving fragments of conservative political culture. Wolff became one of the primary instruments of that interface. He attended functions, managed relationships, appeared at the right events with the right posture and the right words. He was, in many ways, the SS presented in its most acceptable form, soldierly, cultured, and apparently reasonable. This was not accidental. It was a studied construction, and Wolff was both its architect and its product. The years from 1933 to 1939 would later be scrutinized by historians seeking the precise moment at which complicity became something darker. Those who argued for Wolff's culpability pointed to the obvious: a man at the center of Himmler's operations throughout the period when the SS was constructing its apparatus of political terror, when concentration camps were expanding from isolated facilities into a systematic network, when the definition of who counted as an enemy of the Reich was being drawn and redrawn with fatal consequences, cannot claim ignorance. The information passed through his office. The system grew under his administrative supervision. The position he occupied was not the position of a man who did not know. It was the position of a man who knew precisely how much to know and when to know it. And yet Wolff, in the way of very intelligent people who have constructed their lives around a certain image of themselves, found ways to maintain an interior distance from what the organization he served was becoming. He spoke later of administrative duties, of logistics and personnel, of the management of an office rather than the direction of violence. There is something revealing in the careful grammar of these later defenses, the passive constructions, the managed abstractions, the tendency to describe structure rather than consequence. Whatever was true inside him, the outward man remained composed. The SS general who had risen from relative obscurity to stand beside one of the most powerful men in Germany showed no public sign of the weight he may or may not have felt. By the late 1930s, the partnership between Wolff and Himmler was one of the defining professional relationships within the Nazi hierarchy. Colleagues noted its durability with a mixture of respect and wariness. Himmler trusted Wolff with a consistency that he offered very few, an unusual quality in a world built on suspicion and the constant recalculation of loyalty. Wolff, for his part, had made himself so central to Himmler's functioning that separation would have been, in practical terms, almost impossible. He had become not merely useful but necessary, and necessity, inside a system like this one, was the most reliable form of protection available. The question was how long that protection would hold, and what it would cost to maintain it. The boy from Darmstadt, who had once navigated the confusion of Weimar Germany with bright eyes and careful ambition, had arrived, by the threshold of the war years, at a position of extraordinary influence inside an extraordinary machine. He had not conquered it in any conventional sense. He had grown into it so smoothly, so precisely, that it was sometimes difficult to see where the man ended and the institution began. That ambiguity would haunt him across the decades that followed, through war, through surrender, through trial, through reinvention. But in those years of consolidation and expansion, the full force of that future reckoning lay still ahead, and Karl Wolff stood at Himmler's shoulder, immaculate in his black uniform, reading the room as he had always read rooms, watching which way the world was turning. By the middle of 1934, Karl Wolff had already learned one of the most valuable lessons available to an ambitious man inside the Third Reich, that patience, performed with perfect stillness, was itself a form of power. He had settled into his role beside Heinrich Himmler, not as a subordinate who merely executed orders, but as something closer to an architect, someone who understood that the organization growing around them was not yet a finished structure, but a vast project under continuous construction. The SS at this point was still finding its shape, its doctrine, its place within the broader machinery of the Nazi state, and Wolff, with his banker's mind and his soldier's bearing, was precisely the kind of man Himmler needed to pour the concrete while he himself sketched the blueprints. Others, in the upper reaches of the movement, were louder, more theatrical, more visibly dangerous. Wolff understood that the quiet man behind the desk, the one who controlled correspondence, scheduled meetings, filtered information, and managed the flow of people into and out of the Reichsführer's presence, held a very particular kind of influence. It was not glamorous, but it was durable. The SS in those years was transforming at a pace that would have overwhelmed a lesser administrator. What had begun as a small personal bodyguard for Adolf Hitler was becoming something far more ambitious, a state within a state, a parallel authority with its own intelligence apparatus, its own armed units, its own racial bureaucracy, and its own expanding network of institutions and obligations. Himmler's vision for the organization was sweeping and, in the most literal sense, totalizing. He imagined the SS as the biological and ideological vanguard of a reordered civilization. Wolff did not always share the mystical intensity of that vision, but he grasped its operational implications with great clarity. Someone had to manage the correspondence between the Reichsführer and the various SS regional commanders. Someone had to coordinate the increasingly complex relationships between the SS and the regular police forces being absorbed into Himmler's growing empire. Someone had to ensure that the paperwork of ambition was filed in perfect order. That someone, with growing regularity, was Karl Wolff. He was meticulous in ways that earned him genuine respect from colleagues who might otherwise have resented his proximity to Himmler. Wolff ran the Reichsführer's personal staff with a precision that people noticed and, privately, relied upon. Meetings happened when Wolff said they would happen. Information reached Himmler in the form Wolff had shaped it. Requests from subordinates were processed, prioritized, and returned with responses that bore Wolff's invisible fingerprints even when they carried Himmler's signature. This was not manipulation in any crude sense. It was something more sophisticated than that. Wolff had developed a talent for translating between the grandiose and the practical, for taking Himmler's often abstract or ideologically inflected directives and rendering them into forms that could be acted upon by the men and women working below. In an organization with enormous pretensions and enormous practical challenges, that translation capacity was invaluable. Then came the 30th of June, 1934, the event that would later be called the Night of the Long Knives, and which sent tremors through every part of the Nazi power structure. Ernst Röhm, the head of the Sturmabteilung, the brown-shirted paramilitary force that had helped carry the Nazi movement through its street-fighting years, was executed along with scores of his associates. The SA was effectively decapitated in a single brutal weekend. Hitler, convinced or persuaded that Röhm represented a threat to his authority, authorized a purge that settled factional scores, eliminated potential rivals, and sent an unmistakable message about the price of disloyalty. It was a moment of raw, undisguised violence at the heart of the regime, and every senior figure in the SS had to navigate it carefully. The SS itself had participated directly in the killings. Whatever distance a man might have hoped to maintain between himself and the bloodshed was largely closed. Wolff's position during those days was, in its own way, revealing. He was not among the men who pulled triggers or gave direct killing orders that weekend. His role remained administrative, coordinative, at one remove from the physical act. But that remove was not the same as innocence, and Wolff understood as much. The Night of the Long Knives established a principle that would govern the rest of his career, that loyalty inside the Third Reich was not a sentiment but a performance, and that the performance had to be visible, consistent, and credible. Those who had shown any hesitation, any ambiguity in their allegiance during the purge, found themselves quietly reassigned, demoted, or simply forgotten. Wolff showed no such hesitation. His allegiance to Himmler, and through Himmler to Hitler, was communicated clearly and without apparent reservation. He emerged from that weekend with his position intact and, if anything, slightly strengthened. The years that followed saw the SS consolidate its hold on German internal security in ways that reshaped the entire architecture of the state. Himmler's acquisition of control over the German police in the mid-1930s was a bureaucratic achievement of the First Order, and Wolff was deeply embedded in the machinery that made it possible. The merging of SS and police functions created an organization with surveillance and enforcement capabilities that no previous German government had possessed, and managing the personnel relationships across that newly combined structure required enormous administrative energy. Wolff provided much of it. He was in regular contact with regional commanders, with legal officials whose cooperation Himmler needed, with economic administrators whose resources the SS wanted access to. He moved through these relationships with a social ease that Himmler himself, more awkward and more fanatical in personal presentation, could not always replicate. There was, too, a more personal dimension to Wolff's consolidating position. He was regarded within the SS as one of its more presentable faces, tall, well-spoken, attractive in the particular way that the regime liked its public servants to be attractive, which is to say, he looked the part of the ideal they promoted without quite being a caricature of it. He appeared at public events, at diplomatic receptions, at internal ceremonies where the SS displayed itself to the German public or to foreign visitors. When it was useful for the organization to project an image of disciplined, cultured authority rather than crude brutality, Wolff was available for that projection. He understood his own utility in this regard, and he used it without apparent discomfort. The gap between the organization's public face and its internal realities was something he navigated rather than questioned. His influence over SS ideology was less doctrinal than environmental. Wolff was not a theorist. He did not write pamphlets or deliver lectures on racial science or the mystical heritage of the Germanic peoples, but he shaped the culture of Himmler's immediate circle by embodying a particular model of the SS officer: composed, efficient, socially confident, ruthlessly loyal, and apparently untouched by doubt. The men who wanted access to the Reichsführer observed Wolff and understood, consciously or otherwise, what kind of behavior was rewarded in that proximity. His personal style became a template, not because he imposed it, but because it was demonstrably successful. Inside bureaucracies, success teaches more than any manual. Through the latter half of the 1930s, as Germany moved with accelerating confidence toward territorial expansion, the SS expanded alongside it. New units were formed, new responsibilities acquired, new relationships forged with economic institutions, with legal bodies, with the Wehrmacht. Each expansion brought administrative complexity, and administrative complexity brought more work to Wolff's desk. He managed the Reichsführer's correspondence with a scope that now encompassed not just internal SS matters, but sensitive communications with foreign governments, with business leaders, with figures in the military high command. He was, in a very real sense, one of the most informed men in Germany, not because he sought information for its own sake, but because information flowed naturally through the position he occupied. Himmler trusted him with things that were not written down anywhere else, because Wolff had demonstrated over years that he was a man who understood the difference between what could be said and what could only be understood. It would be too simple to say that Wolff thrived in this period simply because he was competent, though competence was surely part of it. He thrived because he had calibrated something essential about the organization he served, that the SS, for all its ideological fervor, ran on the same fuel as any other large institution, on personal relationships, on the management of egos, on the reliable performance of administrative tasks that nobody glamorous wanted to claim, but everyone needed done. Wolff claimed those tasks. He made himself indispensable in the way that truly durable bureaucrats always make themselves indispensable, not by being irreplaceable in any single function, but by being present, reliable, and trusted across so many functions simultaneously that removing him would require unpicking something load-bearing in the entire structure. By 1939, when Germany stood on the edge of the war that would define and ultimately destroy the regime, Wolff had spent the better part of 6 years building a position of extraordinary internal influence. He was not the man whose name appeared in newspaper headlines. He was not the man who gave speeches at rallies or who received foreign ambassadors in formal ceremony. He was the man who ensured that Himmler's empire ran, who smoothed the frictions, managed the relationships, coordinated the communications, and presented to the world outside a face of composed authority. The cost of that position, in terms of what it required him to know, to facilitate, and to remain silent about, was a cost he had so far declined to examine too closely. But that reckoning still lay over the horizon, and in the summer of 1939, Wolff was at the height of his influence within a regime about to launch itself into catastrophe. The consolidation was complete. What came next would test everything it had built. The summer of 1939 carried a strange electricity across Europe. Diplomats moved through capital cities with creased brows and terse telegrams. Newspapers printed maps with thick arrows pointing east. And in Berlin, inside the expanding bureaucratic fortress of the SS, Karl Wolff watched the machinery of state tighten itself like a coil. He had spent 6 years at Himmler's side, learning the rhythms of power, absorbing its logic, shaping himself into the indispensable man. By the time the final weeks of August arrived and the last diplomatic pretenses began to collapse, Wolff was not a man waiting for war. He was a man already positioned for it, already shaped by its anticipation, already woven into the command structure that would direct it. On the 1st of September 1939, German forces crossed into Poland before dawn had fully broken. The world had watched the crisis build for months, and still the moment arrived, like a door slamming shut on everything that came before it. For Karl Wolff, the beginning of the war was not a shock, it was a threshold. He understood, as few men in his position could afford not to, that war would transform the SS from a domestic instrument of political control into something larger, something with territorial ambitions and occupational purpose. The organization he had helped build from a guard unit into a parallel state now had a continent to operate within, and Wolff, standing close to Himmler, understood that proximity to power in peacetime was one thing, but proximity during war was something else entirely. His formal role remained what it had been: Chief of Personal Staff to the Reichsführer SS, the man who managed correspondence, coordinated schedules, filtered access, and translated Himmler's intentions into operational directives. But in wartime, those functions took on a different weight. Himmler himself moved more frequently, spending time at field headquarters, traveling into newly occupied territory, consulting with military commanders and party officials. Wolff moved with him, and where Himmler went, so too went the administrative nerve center of SS decision-making. Within weeks of the Polish campaign's beginning, Wolff found himself not merely a desk officer in Berlin, but a figure crossing into occupied territory, witnessing and facilitating the first extensions of SS authority into the conquered East. What greeted them in Poland was deliberate devastation. The Wehrmacht had struck fast and with overwhelming force, but it was the SS formations that followed with a different kind of purpose. Einsatzgruppen, mobile action groups, had been deployed behind the advancing German lines with orders to neutralize what the Nazi leadership defined as threats to German security. That definition was catastrophically broad. Polish intellectuals, priests, officers, civic leaders, and Jewish communities found themselves targeted in the first weeks of occupation. Wolff was not commanding these units in the field. He was not pulling triggers or issuing the localized orders that sent these groups into villages and town squares, but he existed inside the chain of command that gave those units their authority, their logistics, their operational legitimacy. He knew what was happening. His position made ignorance structurally impossible. Himmler moved through Poland in the autumn of that year, inspecting newly established SS structures, reviewing personnel, meeting with the civilian and military administrators who were beginning to partition the conquered territory. Wolff accompanied him on these visits. He sat in rooms where policies were discussed that would determine the fates of millions of people. He read the reports that passed through Himmler's office because reading and processing those reports was part of what made him indispensable. Every significant communication to and from the Reichsführer SS passed through Wolff's hands or across his desk before it went anywhere else. This was the nature of the role he had built for himself, and in wartime Poland, that role had become something far more consequential than managing a senior official's diary. The SS operations in Poland expanded with remarkable speed. Concentration camps already existing within Germany's pre-war borders began to receive Polish prisoners. New administrative structures were erected to manage occupied territory. The concept of racial resettlement, the forced displacement and murder of populations deemed incompatible with German colonial ambitions, was being put into practice for the first time at scale. Wolff was not designing these policies. The architects sat elsewhere in the Nazi hierarchy, men like Reinhard Heydrich, who ran the Reich Security Main Office, and the ideologues around Himmler, who had spent years theorizing about living space and racial order. But Wolff was the interface. He was the man who kept the system running smoothly at the level of the Reichsführer's office, and a smooth-running system in this context meant a system that could execute horror efficiently. There is a temptation, when examining figures like Wolff, to search for a moment of resistance, a point where the record shows hesitation or refusal. The autumn and winter of 1939 do not offer such a moment. What the record offers instead is a picture of continued diligence, continued loyalty, continued administrative excellence in the service of an enterprise that was already, in its first months of wartime operation, committing acts that would later demand accounting. Wolff's genius for human relations, for managing the sensitivities of powerful men, for appearing simultaneously trustworthy to superiors and approachable to subordinates, all of this served the SS effectively during the Polish occupation. He smoothed tensions between SS commanders and Wehrmacht officers. He managed the communication between Himmler's staff and the civil administration. He kept the system from grinding against itself. Himmler's confidence in Wolff during this period was absolute, and that confidence was not merely personal affection. Though the two men had developed something that functioned like friendship over 6 years of close proximity, it was professional confidence, the kind that comes from watching a man perform under pressure. Wolff had demonstrated that he could handle sensitive information without flinching and without leaking. He had shown that he could represent Himmler's interests in rooms where Himmler himself was not present, and could do so without overreaching or creating new complications. For a man running an organization as politically fraught and internally competitive as the SS, that kind of reliable intermediary was worth more than almost any other resource. Wolff understood this about his own value, and he cultivated it carefully. The machinery being constructed in Poland in the final months of 1939 was only beginning. What existed at the end of that year was the scaffolding of something far more systematically destructive than even the opening months of occupation had suggested. Administrative frameworks were being established. Chains of command were being clarified. The logic of categorization, of sorting human beings into classifications that determined their treatment, was being tested and refined. Wolff existed at a level where he could see the shape of this structure forming. His role required him to understand it, and understanding it, without resistance, without documented protest, without any recorded attempt to redirect or limit what was being built, made him part of its architecture in ways that would take decades to fully assess. By the end of 1939, Germany was at war with Britain and France, as well as having dismembered Poland. The world had changed, and so had the SS. The organization was no longer a domestic political instrument first and foremost. It was an occupying force, an ideological vanguard, a parallel army with its own chain of command and its own territorial claims. And Karl Wolff was, within that organization, one of the most connected men alive. He knew the senior figures across every major SS directorate. He had worked alongside or supervised the careers of men who now commanded formations in the field. His network of professional relationships stretched in every direction, and all of those threads ran, ultimately, back through him and toward Himmler. He was not simply an administrator, he was the connective tissue of the upper SS, and connective tissue, however invisible, is what allows a body to function. There were those around Wolff who struggled with what the war was becoming so quickly. Some found ways to express discomfort privately, in conversations that went unrecorded, or in small acts of bureaucratic friction. Wolff showed none of this, at least not in any form the record preserves. He moved through the first winter of the war with the same polished competence he had brought to peacetime service, perhaps with even greater energy, since war created urgency, and urgency created opportunity for those who could manage complexity under pressure. He was 40 years old when the war began, a man in full command of his abilities and his position, with everything still apparently ascending. The moral weight of what surrounded him, the reports, the operations, the explicit discussions of racial policy in occupied territory, appeared to rest lightly, or at least invisibly, on his shoulders. What September 1939 had started could not be undone. The invasion of Poland was not simply a military campaign. It was the opening of something, a logic, a permission, an abandonment of certain limits that had previously constrained even the most extreme elements of the Nazi system. Wolff was present at that opening. He was not a passive bystander caught in proximity to events he could not influence. He was an active facilitator of the infrastructure that made those events possible. The comfortable narrative that he later constructed for himself, the pragmatist, the man who ultimately worked for peace, would need to be measured against these months, against these rooms, against the reports that crossed his desk in the autumn of the year the war began. Whatever choices he would later make, in Italy, in the secret negotiations of 1944 and 1945, they could not erase what had been enabled in Poland. The weight of that beginning would follow him across every chapter that came after. There is a particular kind of power that never appears on a battlefield. It does not wear mud on its boots or hear the crack of rifle fire at close range. It lives instead in offices, in stacked correspondence, in carbon-copied orders, in the quiet scratch of a pen across a roster. Karl Wolff understood this power better than almost anyone in the SS hierarchy, and from 1939 onward, he wielded it with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years learning exactly how institutions breathe. The war had not changed his function so much as it had expanded it beyond anything imaginable in peacetime. Where once he had managed Himmler's appointments and correspondence within Germany, now the bureaucratic reach extended across conquered nations, across languages, across time zones, across the whole fractured geography of an empire that was still in the act of seizing itself. And at the center of it all, routing the signals and smoothing the machinery, sat Karl Wolff. His formal title in these years was Chief of Personal Staff to the Reichsführer SS, and the phrase sounds almost clerical until one maps what it actually controlled. The personal staff was not a passive secretariat. It was the connective tissue of Himmler's entire empire, the organ through which orders passed from conception to execution, through which appointments were vetted, through which rival SS factions were managed and contained. Every senior SS officer who wanted access to Himmler needed to pass through Wolff's office first. Every operational request that required Himmler's authority was filtered, summarized, and presented by men who answered to Wolff. In an organization defined by competition and internal suspicion, the man who controlled the Reichsführer's attention controlled something close to everything. Wolff had understood this dynamic from his earliest days beside Himmler, and he had never allowed himself to forget it. He cultivated his usefulness the way a careful gardener tends the one tree that shades the entire estate. The occupied territories brought new demands at a pace that might have broken a less methodical mind. Poland had fallen by October of 1939, and almost immediately the SS apparatus began extending its reach across the country. Police formations, ethnic resettlement units, concentration facilities, administrative overlays that sat alongside and frequently above conventional military authority. Wolff's office coordinated the flow of personnel into these structures, posting orders, promotion recommendations, resource allocations. These traveled through his staff. He was not designing the system from first principles. The architecture of occupation had its own dark planners. But Wolff was the man who made the design function, who ensured that the right officers reached the right positions, that communication between Berlin and the occupied East did not dissolve into the chaos that less disciplined administrations might have produced. The machinery worked, in large part, because he insisted it work. There is a distinction that Wolff would later return to many times, the distinction between giving an order and processing one. He would describe himself as an administrator, a coordinator, a man who moved paper rather than people. And on a narrow technical level, that description carries some accuracy. He was rarely the originator of the directives that crossed his desk, the orders for population displacement, for the establishment of labor camps, for the brutal restructuring of conquered societies. These came from higher up, from ideological architects who needed no prompting from Karl Wolff to imagine cruelty on an industrial scale. But the distinction he drew, and would draw again at war crimes tribunals, collapses under scrutiny. A machinery does not run without the man who oils it. An order never executed is not an order at all. His role was to ensure that the worst instructions reached the ground, accurately, efficiently, and without bureaucratic friction. That is not neutrality. That is participation of a very high order. By 1940, with France defeated and the Western Front briefly quiet, the SS expanded its administrative footprint into the new occupied territories of Western Europe. SS police formations moved into the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France. New lines of communication needed establishing. New chains of command required ratification and staffing. Wolff's office absorbed this expansion without apparent strain, a proof of the systems he had spent years building. He travelled during this period, visits to occupied headquarters, inspections, coordination meetings where he represented Himmler's authority in person. He was physically present in some of the structures being built, though the full horror of what those structures would become was still, in 1940, only partially legible even to those inside them. The camps existed, the forced labor existed, the racial laws were being applied across newly conquered populations. Wolff knew all of this. He coordinated the personnel who implemented all of this. The question of what he believed about it would prove considerably harder to answer. His correspondence during these years reflects a man at the height of professional confidence. His letters to subordinates carry the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His notes to Himmler are precise, loyal, occasionally even warm, the voice of a trusted aide who knows his superior's preferences well enough to anticipate them. There is very little in the written record of this period that suggests internal conflict or private reservation. What appears instead is the voice of a senior official deeply invested in the functioning of his institution, proud of its reach, attentive to its needs. Whether that represents his genuine inner state or simply the necessary register of correspondence that might be read by others is a question that no archive can fully resolve. Men in dangerous institutions learn to write carefully. What Wolff felt, as opposed to what he recorded, may have been a different matter entirely. Or it may not have been. The concentration camp system presents the most uncomfortable intersection between Wolff's administrative role and the crimes being committed in his organization's name. By 1941, the camps had moved well beyond their original function as detention facilities for political prisoners. They had become instruments of forced labor on an enormous scale, and the conditions within them were producing mass death through exhaustion, starvation, and deliberate brutality. The SS Economic Administrative Main Office, which oversaw camp operations, fell within the broader SS hierarchy that Wolff's staff helped to coordinate. He was not the camp commandant, he did not design the labor programs, but correspondence flowed through his office that touched on camp matters, on the transfer of prisoners, on staffing questions, on the intersection between camp capacity and SS operational requirements. He was inside this system in a way that closeness to Himmler made unavoidable. The machinery of mass deportation began taking shape in earnest during 1941 and into 1942, as Nazi policy toward Jewish populations across Europe shifted toward what would later be formally understood as the final solution. The planning for this shift, its logistics, its personnel requirements, its coordination across different branches of the state and party, passed through channels that Wolff's office touched. There is documented evidence that Wolff received information about deportation operations. There is evidence that his staff processed correspondence related to the transport of Jewish populations eastward, to camps from which many would not return. The claim that he was unaware of what these transports meant, which he would later make under oath, is a claim that history has treated with sustained skepticism. A man of his seniority, his proximity to Himmler, his access to operational communications across the entire SS empire. Such a man does not remain ignorant of the system's central purpose unless he chooses, very deliberately, not to know. And yet the machinery of knowledge in a totalitarian state is itself a complicated structure. Information was compartmentalized by design. Not every fact was shared with every senior official, even those who might seem positioned to receive it. Wolff sat at a node in the network where enormous amounts of operational detail passed through his hands, but not all of it arrived with full explanation attached. He knew enough to understand the shape of things. Whether he knew enough to understand every specific outcome is a distinction that post-war legal proceedings would spend considerable time examining. The honest assessment is probably that his knowledge was substantial, that he understood the broad nature of what the SS was doing in the occupied East, and that his administrative contributions made those operations more effective than they would otherwise have been. That is a form of complicity with very little room for comfortable qualification. Through all of this, his personal relationship with Himmler remained the central fact of his professional existence. Himmler trusted Wolff not simply because Wolff was competent, the SS had competent men in abundance, but because Wolff had demonstrated over nearly a decade that he could be discreet, that he understood the unspoken rules of operating at the summit of a criminal state, and that his loyalty was reliable under pressure. This trust came with privileges. It also came with an ever-deepening entanglement in the Reichsführer's projects, including the darkest ones. To be Himmler's closest aide in this period was to be adjacent to the worst acts of the 20th century. Wolff accepted that proximity and its benefits without recorded complaint for years. The complications, when they came, would arrive later, and from directions that, in 1941, he could not yet fully see. What the years between 1939 and 1942 produced, above all else, was a Karl Wolff who was deeply and structurally embedded in the apparatus of Nazi occupation and terror. He had not merely worn a uniform and saluted. He had administered, he had coordinated, he had ensured that one of history's most destructive bureaucracies continued to function at a high level of operational effectiveness during the period of its greatest expansion. The roads into that complicity had been built gradually, each step following logically from the one before, from party work to SS service, from adjutancy to chief of staff, from coordinating Himmler's schedule to coordinating the infrastructure of an empire built on violence. By the time the Eastern Front opened in June of 1941, and the scale of the killing truly became vast, Wolff was not a man standing at a threshold deciding whether to enter. He was already deep inside the building, and had been for years. The question of whether he would ever find his way toward the door, and what that journey would cost and mean still lay ahead of him, somewhere in the smoke of a war that was, for now, still going exactly as Berlin had planned. In the summer of 1941, the German army crossed into the Soviet Union in what would become the largest military operation in human history. 3 million troops advanced eastward in the space of weeks, and behind them came a different kind of force, one that operated according to orders that existed in shadows and whispers rather than official military channels. These were the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units of the SS, tasked with eliminating what the regime classified as ideological and racial threats. They moved through conquered territory with chilling methodical purpose, and Karl Wolff, sitting in Berlin at SS headquarters, became one of the men responsible for keeping them supplied, coordinated, and connected to the machinery of command that made their work possible. By this point in his career, Wolff had become indispensable to Heinrich Himmler in ways that transcended ordinary administrative duty. He was no longer merely an adjutant or aide, though those titles remained on paper. He had evolved into something far more consequential, a man who understood the full scope of what was happening, who could communicate without excessive words the intentions of his superior, and who possessed the rare combination of intelligence and discretion that allowed him to move between the official world and the realm of unspoken operations. Himmler relied on Wolff to coordinate logistics that other men simply would not touch, to draft communications that conveyed meaning through careful language, and to manage the flow of information about operations that could not be discussed in ordinary terms. This was not a position of innocence, and Wolff, by this stage in his life, would have known precisely what that meant. The Einsatzgruppen operated according to what historians would later describe as a hierarchy of orders that existed partially outside conventional military structure. These mobile units, ranging in size from several hundred to several thousand men each, were tasked with following the army into newly conquered Soviet territory and conducting mass executions of communist functionaries, Soviet officers, and above all, Jewish populations they encountered. The operations were not improvised atrocities, but rather meticulously organized killing campaigns, backed by detailed planning, careful logistics, and regular reporting systems that fed information back to Berlin. Wolff's office received these reports. He would have read them, processed them, understood their implications. They came in the form of statistics, location information, resource requirements, and operational summaries that made clear the scale and nature of what was being conducted in the occupied territories. The communication systems that Wolff oversaw were crucial to this machinery. Orders flowing from Berlin to the Einsatzgruppen required coordination through multiple channels, and Wolff's position placed him at a nexus of that command structure. Himmler's personal authority derived much of its power from the ability to direct operations across vast distances through reliable communication networks. Wolff managed aspects of those networks. He ensured that orders reached the right people, that resources were allocated appropriately, that information flowed back to Berlin in organized fashion. He did not pull triggers or order executions directly, but he made possible the coordination that allowed such operations to function on the scale they achieved. There is a temptation to treat administrative complicity as something distinct from direct participation, and surely the psychological distance was real. Yet the machinery itself could not function without men like Wolff working precisely where he worked. Around this same period, between 1941 and 1942, Wolff began to exhibit signs of inner conflict that would become more pronounced as time progressed. Various accounts from those who knew him suggest that he voiced private doubts about the direction of the war and the methods being employed, though always with careful language that would not amount to actual opposition. He may have made comments to trusted colleagues about the necessity of what was happening, or conversely, about the challenges it created. Some accounts suggest he expressed concern about the sustainability of the regime's policies or the moral costs of total commitment to ideological goals. Yet simultaneously, he continued to perform his duties with efficiency and without public resistance. This was the paradox that would define much of his remaining wartime experience. A man capable of seeing the nature of what he served, perhaps even capable of feeling some measure of unease about it, yet unwilling to translate that unease into any meaningful opposition. Himmler's trust in Wolff during this period reached its apex precisely because Wolff demonstrated this particular combination of qualities. The Reichsführer SS needed people around him who could understand the full scope of his ambitions without requiring constant explicit justification. He needed men who could coordinate operations involving mass death without flinching, without requiring moral reassurance, without creating the friction that came from conscience or hesitation. Wolff fit this profile in ways that made him invaluable. He was intelligent enough to understand the ideological framework, sophisticated enough to operate within it without appearing naive, and controlled enough to maintain composure while overseeing logistics that would have shattered many men. Himmler began delegating to Wolff with increasing confidence, sharing with him information about ongoing operations, discussing with him the larger strategic directions the SS was pursuing, treating him as something approximating a confidant. The scale of killing operations in the Soviet Union during 1941 and 1942 defies easy comprehension. Hundreds of thousands of people were executed through the Einsatzgruppen operations in the months following the German invasion. These were not incidental deaths resulting from combat, but rather systematic mass executions conducted according to explicit ideological criteria. The Einsatzgruppen reported their activities regularly, and those reports made their way through official channels to Berlin. Wolff would have been aware of the general scale and nature of these operations through his position in Himmler's office. He may not have read every detailed report, but he would have possessed sufficient understanding to know that what was occurring represented a fundamental crossing of a moral boundary that would be impossible to uncross. Once this knowledge existed, once he had demonstrated his ability to function within a system that operated on such premises, the distinction between knowledge and complicity became increasingly blurred. What made Wolff's position particularly significant was that he was not a believer in the ideological framework that justified these operations. Unlike many SS officers who possessed genuine commitment to Nazi racial ideology, Wolff was fundamentally a pragmatist and careerist. He had adopted the rhetoric of the regime, he worked within its structures, but he did not appear to harbor the deep ideological convictions that drove men like Himmler or the Einsatzgruppen commanders. This made him simultaneously more morally culpable in some respects and more potentially redeemable in others. A man motivated purely by ideological belief operates within a closed logical system where actions are justified by comprehensive worldview. A man like Wolff, motivated primarily by career advancement and loyalty to a superior, operates within a different kind of system, one where actions become possible precisely because they are separated from ideological conviction, where one simply does what is required by the position one occupies. In some ways, this made his participation more troubling, not less. Throughout 1941 and into 1942, Wolff maintained the external appearance of a satisfied servant of the regime. He was promoted, honored, and given increasing responsibility. Photographs from this period show him in dress uniform at official events, standing beside Himmler at ceremonies and gatherings, a man clearly confident in his position and his future. Yet beneath this surface, something was shifting. The war was not developing as the regime had anticipated. The Soviet Union, rather than collapsing under the weight of the initial invasion, was demonstrating a capacity for resistance that astonished German planners. The Einsatzgruppen, despite their vast killing operations, were not solving the problems the regime believed they would solve. The entire strategic framework that had justified the Eastern Campaign was beginning to show cracks. Wolff, intelligent and observant, would have registered these developments. He would have understood that the regime was facing a potential long-term crisis, even if victory still seemed possible in the near term. It was during this period that Wolff began to think, at least privately and tentatively, about possibilities beyond the framework he had always inhabited. The thought processes were almost surely not articulated clearly even to himself. He did not make sudden declarations about rejecting Nazism or opposing the regime. Rather, there emerged a kind of subtle repositioning, a slight increase in distance between himself and the most extreme elements of SS ideology, a slightly more pronounced interest in the practical administration of occupied territories rather than purely ideological goals. Some accounts suggest he began to cultivate relationships with military officers and other officials who represented different bureaucratic traditions within the German state, men who were not primarily motivated by SS ideology. These connections would later become significant when options for a different path began to emerge. But in 1941 and 1942, they were simply prudent networking by a man beginning to think about futures that might not necessarily align perfectly with the trajectory of the regime. The moral weight of this period, the moment when Wolff became aware of and complicit in systematic mass killing, cannot be understated. This was not a remote administrative position, not a matter of signing documents without understanding their content. Wolff was close enough to Himmler, sufficiently involved in high-level coordination, deeply enough positioned in the SS hierarchy that he possessed knowledge of what was happening in the Soviet Union. He understood the scope of the killing operations, the systematic nature of their organization, and the fact that they were being conducted according to deliberate policy emanating from the highest levels of the regime. He continued to perform his duties efficiently, to accept promotion, to remain outwardly loyal to Himmler. Whether he experienced genuine moral disturbance or simply the practical concern of a pragmatist, recognizing that events were not unfolding as anticipated, he now carried within himself the knowledge that he had functioned and would continue to function within a system organized around industrial-scale murder. This knowledge would remain with him, shaping his calculations and his choices until the very end of the war. By the end of 1942, Wolff had reached a kind of plateau in his advancement through the SS hierarchy. He had achieved considerable power and influence through his position as Himmler's chief of staff. Yet he was also trapped within the very proximity that had advanced him. He was bound to Himmler by ties of loyalty and by knowledge that made him valuable but also vulnerable. The Eastern Campaign had revealed the limits of German power, and with those limits came the first genuine possibility that the regime might not prevail indefinitely. For a man like Wolff, for whom ideology was always secondary to position and survival, this realization would become the crucial fact that began to reshape his thinking about what the future might hold. The machinery he had helped coordinate continued to function, but somewhere within his consciousness, the question began to form: what happened to men like him if the machine eventually stopped? The answer to that question would gradually become clear, and it would eventually lead him toward a path that would define the final chapter of his wartime experience. In the winter of 1942, the Third Reich faced a crisis that no propaganda film could conceal. At Stalingrad, on the frozen banks of the Volga River, the German Sixth Army was dying. Hundreds of thousands of men had marched into that city expecting victory. Instead, they found encirclement, starvation, and an enemy that refused to break. The radio transmissions from the front grew weaker each week until they stopped altogether. In Berlin, the machinery of state that Karl Wolff had spent a decade building began to show its first true fractures. He was Himmler's adjutant, his closest confidant, a man who had access to every corner of the SS apparatus. He knew, perhaps better than anyone except Himmler himself, that Germany was losing a war it had sworn to win. The scale of the disaster unfolded slowly in official channels, but with shattering clarity to those who understood how to read between the lines of military reports. Stalingrad was not merely a battlefield setback, it was a psychological rupture. The myth of German military superiority, the guarantee that had underwritten the entire Nazi system, had been shattered against Soviet determination and winter. Wolff observed this moment with the acute awareness of a man watching the foundations of his entire world shift beneath his feet. He had invested more than a decade in the SS, watching it grow from a paramilitary organization into something approaching a state within the state. His loyalty to Himmler was genuine, born of years of intimate professional relationship and shared conviction in the necessity of absolute order. Yet even loyalty has limits when the structure it serves begins to collapse. In the spring of 1943, Italy surrendered. Mussolini's regime, Germany's greatest ally, fell apart like wet paper. Italian soldiers laid down their weapons or changed sides. The Reich suddenly faced not one, but two major fronts, deteriorating in synchronization, as if history itself was conducting a chorus of reversal. It was during these months that Wolff's conversations began to change in character. Not dramatically, he was far too careful for theatrical gestures of doubt, but to those who knew him well, who understood the careful modulations of his voice and the precise control of his expressions, something had shifted. In private meetings with trusted colleagues, discussions would sometimes drift beyond the immediate operational concerns of the day. What would happen, someone might ask carefully, if the Russians broke through in the south? What if the Allies managed to establish themselves on the continent? These were not treasonous questions, not quite. They were the kind of cautious speculation that officers engaged in, the necessary mental preparation for contingencies that planners must consider. Yet there was something different about the tone when Wolff participated in these conversations. He listened more than he spoke. He asked probing questions rather than offering pronouncements. For a man accustomed to the authority of his position, to the reflexive deference that came with being Himmler's representative, this was a subtle but unmistakable change. The question of Germany's future began to haunt certain circles within the Nazi hierarchy. There were officers who had begun to recognize, with a clarity that bordered on desperation, that the war could not be won in the conventional sense. The Russians could not be pushed back far enough to be beaten. The Americans, once they arrived in numbers on European soil, could not be driven into the sea. The arithmetic of total war, when calculated honestly, led to only one conclusion. Germany faced either negotiated settlement or annihilation. This realization did not lead to immediate action or to dramatic conspiracies. Instead, it created a kind of shadow conversation that moved through the high command like a current beneath the surface. Wolff, positioned as he was, close to Himmler but not blind to reality, powerful but not all-powerful, found himself in a unique position to hear these whispers and to wonder about them. He was not yet a conspirator. To call him such would be an overstatement. But he was becoming something more complex, a man forced to acknowledge possibilities that the official ideology of the regime could not accommodate. By the summer of 1943, Wolff's awareness of anti-Nazi resistance networks had begun to deepen, not through any dramatic conversion or sudden ideological shift, but through the ordinary mechanics of intelligence work and administrative knowledge. As chief of staff to the Reichsführer, he was exposed to reports from the Gestapo about dissident elements. He knew about the resistance networks, the military officers who spoke in careful language about alternatives, the churches that harbored doubts, the intellectuals who imagined different futures. In an earlier phase of his career, this knowledge would have meant only one thing: identification and elimination. But now, in 1943, with the momentum of history running visibly against the Reich, that simple certainty had become complicated. He did not publicly acknowledge these contacts. He did not suddenly begin attending secret meetings in Berlin apartments or maintaining double correspondence. But he became aware in a new way. Information that might have been filtered out before now lodged in his mind and would not leave. The motivations that drove Wolff during this period are impossibly difficult to untangle from our present distance. There was, undoubtedly, an element of self-preservation. Any intelligent man could see that the Reich was mortgaging its future at an accelerating rate. Those who had built their careers on Nazi assumptions might not survive the reckoning that seemed increasingly inevitable. Wolff was not innocent of this calculation. He was a man of ambition who had risen through a system that required ruthlessness. It would be naive to imagine that self-interest played no role in his changing perspective. Yet to suggest that it was merely self-interest is to miss something that the historical record hints at but cannot fully confirm. There were conversations, we know from later accounts, in which Wolff spoke with something approaching despair about the direction the regime had taken. References to the camps, to the killing operations in the East, to the systematic machinery of murder that he, as an SS officer, could not pretend not to see. Whether this represented genuine moral reckoning or a retrospective construction imposed on memory is a question that haunts any honest assessment of Wolff's character. What is certain is that by late 1943, Wolff had begun to position himself differently within the apparatus of power. He maintained his formal loyalty to Himmler and to the Nazi state with impeccable precision. He continued to perform his duties as chief of staff, to manage the vast administrative machinery of the SS, to appear in uniform at official functions. But simultaneously, almost imperceptibly, he was beginning to create space for himself, to establish relationships and connections that did not depend entirely on the survival of the Nazi system. This was not yet betrayal in any actionable sense. It was something more subtle and perhaps more psychologically complex, a man beginning to hedge his bets without admitting that he was doing so. The first tentative contacts with anti-Nazi elements that occurred during this period left no dramatic traces in the historical record. They were not conspiratorial meetings, but rather conversations that happened to occur, remarks that suggested openness to alternative thinking, quiet availability to those who might wish to know that at least one person in the highest levels of the SS was not entirely closed to the possibility of a different future. The nature of Wolff's contact with the resistance remains obscured by the fog of war and the deliberate destruction of evidence by all parties involved. What we can establish is that by 1943, he had become aware of networks that existed in opposition to the Nazi regime. Whether he actively cultivated these contacts or merely allowed them to approach him is a distinction that probably mattered less than the simple fact of his openness. He did not report these approaches to the Gestapo for elimination. He did not treat them as threats that required immediate suppression. Instead, he listened. He asked questions. He allowed conversations to develop in ways that suggested he was considering possibilities that the official Nazi theology would not permit. This was a dangerous position to occupy, requiring an exceptional degree of political dexterity. One misstep, one injudicious remark to the wrong person, and Wolff could have found himself subject to the same machinery of destruction he had helped to build. The fall of Italy in September 1943 occurred at precisely the moment when Wolff's internal calculations had reached a critical point. The Italian surrender was not a distant event to be analyzed from Berlin. It was something that would immediately reshape the political and military realities in which the SS operated. When German commanders in Italy began to discuss the terms under which they might negotiate with the Allies, they were discussing exactly the kind of thing that would have seemed unthinkable to Wolff just years earlier. Yet even then, he did not immediately recognize that his own path was being prepared by circumstances beyond his control. The SS command structure in Italy would require someone who understood both the necessity of German military authority and the practical realities of occupation in a territory that no longer belonged to Germany, but had not yet been conquered by anyone else. It would require a man who was at home in ambiguity, who could maintain loyalty to Berlin while adapting to local circumstances, who understood that sometimes victory meant something different from what the official definitions suggested. That man would be Karl Wolff. The months between Stalingrad and his appointment to Italy were marked by an almost visible tension within Wolff's consciousness. He remained the loyal adjutant, the careful administrator, the SS officer who understood hierarchy and obedience. Yet he was simultaneously becoming something else, a man who could imagine alternatives, who had begun to hear the whispers of a different path, who was asking himself questions that ideology had been designed to suppress. These are the internal contradictions that define men during historical upheavals, the moment when the future is no longer assured, when the certainties of the past begin to dissolve, and when choices that had seemed impossible become suddenly, urgently real. For Wolff, that moment had arrived. He did not yet know it, but the personal and historical drama of his life was about to enter a new phase, one in which the private doubts he harbored and the official position he maintained would be driven into direct and increasingly irreconcilable conflict. The question of who Karl Wolff truly was, whether he was fundamentally a man of principle, discovering conscience in the wreckage of ideology, or a pragmatist willing to betray any system that no longer served his interests, would begin its slow, agonizing answer. In the autumn of 1943, the architecture of German power in Europe began to fracture. Not suddenly, not with the thunderous collapse that would come 2 years later, but with a series of tremors that suggested the foundation itself had begun to shift. For Karl Wolff, the command structure that had sheltered and elevated him through a decade of rising Nazi dominance was suddenly, unexpectedly, opening new pathways. The news arrived first through official channels, then spread through whispered conversations in the corridors of power. Italy, that ancient seat of Mediterranean civilization, was collapsing. Mussolini's regime, which had marched alongside Hitler since the Spanish Civil War, which had promised Rome reborn and glory restored, was fracturing under the weight of military defeat and popular exhaustion. The Italian people, after 3 years of total war and mounting casualties, had begun to turn against their duce, and in the halls where power was measured and distributed in Nazi Berlin, this catastrophe meant opportunity. The Italian surrender in the early days of September 1943 was both shocking and predictable. Shocking because the myth of Axis unity had been so carefully cultivated, so essential to the psychological architecture of Nazi propaganda that its rupture seemed almost unthinkable, and yet predictable because anyone watching the theatres of war with clear eyes could see that Italy had become a liability rather than an asset. The invasion of Sicily 2 months earlier had succeeded with brutal efficiency. American and British forces had established themselves on the island with surprising speed, and the Italian military, demoralized and under-equipped, had crumbled. The population of Sicily and southern Italy had not rushed to defend fascism with the fervor that German propaganda suggested they would. Instead, many had actively helped the advancing Allies. Within weeks of the Sicilian landings, the political foundations of Mussolini's regime had begun to erode. Politicians who had stood beside him for 2 decades suddenly remembered other loyalties, other possibilities. And on the 12th of September, just as the Wehrmacht was beginning to stabilize the Italian mainland, the Italian government formally surrendered to the Allies. For Hitler and his immediate circle, this was not merely a military setback. It was a betrayal, a fracture in the facade of Axis strength at precisely the moment when the war was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. German intelligence had known for weeks that elements within the Italian government were exploring peace negotiations, but the speed of the collapse still shocked Berlin. Within hours of the official announcement, Hitler was already issuing orders for the military occupation of large portions of Italy. German forces, hastily deployed and moving with typical German efficiency, poured across the border from the north. They disarmed Italian military units, occupied key positions, and began to consolidate German control over the peninsula. It was a military operation of remarkable coordination, executed largely without the consent or cooperation of the Italian government that was supposedly Germany's ally. This was the new reality of Axis partnership, now revealed in its true nature. Italy would not be occupied as a conquered enemy, but seized as a recalcitrant subordinate, its armed forces disarmed and its government transformed into a puppet state. Into this chaos, in late September 1943, Karl Wolff received his new assignment. He was summoned to Hitler's headquarters and informed that he would be leaving Berlin. His years as Himmler's chief of staff, the administrative architect of SS expansion, and the man who orchestrated the vast machinery of SS power across occupied territories, were entering a new phase. Wolff would be appointed as the senior SS and police leader in Italy, commander of all SS forces in the Italian theatre. It was a remarkable promotion in certain respects, a clear sign of Hitler's confidence and of Himmler's willingness to deploy his most capable subordinate to a crisis zone. And yet it was also, in a different sense, a removal. Berlin was the center of power in the Nazi state, where decisions were made and where proximity to Hitler determined influence and trajectory. Italy, by contrast, was a periphery, a secondary theater where the real war was being decided elsewhere. The Eastern Front consumed resources and attention. The anticipated Allied invasion of France demanded constant planning and preparation. And yet Italy could not be ignored. It was strategically important, economically valuable, and politically significant as the first place where an Axis power had collapsed. Someone of capability and loyalty was needed to manage it. Wolff departed for Italy in October 1943, leaving behind the familiar structures of Berlin power. What he found there was far more complex than a simple military command. The Italian peninsula had been divided. The Allies held Sicily and much of southern Italy and were preparing for their advance northward. German and Italian forces held the central and northern portions of the country, but the political situation was far more fractured than any simple military map could suggest. In northern Italy, German authorities were establishing what would become the Italian Social Republic, a puppet state ostensibly led by a rescued Mussolini, now rescued from imprisonment by German paratroopers and reinstalled as a figurehead. Around Milan, Verona, and the other northern cities, a new fascist administration was being constructed, this one even more dependent on German military support than the previous regime had been. And into this tangle of competing authorities, German military commanders, SS officials, and Italian functionaries seeking to preserve what remained of their power and status, Wolff inserted himself as the representative of the SS, the man who embodied Heinrich Himmler's authority in Italy. The situation Wolff inherited was, in many respects, less controlled than the vast bureaucratic structures he had managed in Berlin. In the Reich itself, the SS had established its authority over nearly all aspects of state and society. Police functions, intelligence operations, racial policy, and military formations all flowed through SS channels, all answered ultimately to Himmler, who answered to Hitler. The apparatus was terrible in its efficiency, precisely because it was so thoroughly unified and coordinated. But Italy was different. Here, the SS was not supreme. German military commanders, particularly those from the Wehrmacht, who had been fighting in Italy and who had established their authority before the SS arrived in force, maintained independent command structures. The Italian Social Republic had its own governmental apparatus, its own security forces, and its own agenda for preserving Italian interests and authority. And beyond these official structures, the resistance was growing. Partisans, particularly in the northern regions, were beginning to organize and fight, drawing support from the population and supplied increasingly by the Allies. Italy was becoming a place where German authority was real but contested, where compromise and negotiation existed alongside ruthless enforcement, where the absolute certainty of Nazi power that had characterized the Reich itself was showing its first significant cracks. Within weeks of his arrival in Italy, Wolff had established his headquarters and begun the process of consolidating SS authority. He moved carefully, aware that he needed to balance his role as Himmler's representative with the practical realities of the Italian situation. He built relationships with the German military commanders, particularly Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the overall German commander in Italy, and General Karl Wolff, who shared his name but little else. He navigated the complex political waters of the Italian Social Republic, understanding that Mussolini's new regime, weak as it was, could not be entirely bypassed or ignored. He began implementing SS security measures, establishing intelligence networks, and organizing police operations to suppress the growing resistance. And yet, almost from the beginning, Wolff was also learning something crucial. He was learning that the absolute certainty, the ideological clarity, the total commitment to Nazi victory that had sustained him in Berlin might not be the only possible response to the deteriorating military situation. Italy, in its very disorder, its very complexity, suggested that other possibilities might exist. The autumn and winter of 1943 saw Wolff establishing himself as one of the most powerful German officials in Italy. He commanded the SS formations in the Italian theatre, thousands of men organized into fighting units, security forces, and administrative bodies. He answered only to Himmler in matters of SS authority, giving him a degree of independence from the normal German military command structure. And unlike the absolute clarity of his earlier years in Berlin, where his role was clearly defined within a rigid hierarchy, in Italy, Wolff found himself in a situation where interpretation and adaptation were necessary. The goals were still the same in formal terms. Germany was fighting for victory, and the SS was fighting for the Führer. But the practical meaning of those slogans, the actual day-to-day conduct of policy and operations, admitted of more flexibility than it had in the carefully controlled bureaucratic systems of the Reich. The Italian situation created what might be called moral and practical space, though Wolff would not have used such language at the time, and perhaps could not have articulated what was happening to his thinking. But beginning in these months, in late 1943 and early 1944, the fundamental certainty that had guided his actions began to undergo a barely perceptible shift. He was still loyal to Himmler, still committed to Nazi Germany's cause, still implementing policies that were fundamentally cruel and exploitative. And yet he was also a practical administrator who saw that the war was not going as planned, who understood that German victory, once assumed as inevitable, was now far less certain. Italy had shown him that Axis unity was fragile, that governments could collapse, that change was possible in ways that had seemed unthinkable just months before. These were dangerous thoughts for an officer in the Nazi state, dangerous because they could lead toward doubt, and doubt could lead toward the kind of disloyalty that the regime ruthlessly punished. And yet they were thoughts that were becoming increasingly common among German military and political leaders as the war turned against them. For Wolff, Italy was the place where such thoughts first began to take root. The strategic military situation in the Italian theatre was deteriorating as winter turned to spring. The Allies, despite setbacks and difficult terrain, were slowly pushing northward. German defences held, but only through constant reinforcement and effort. The prospect of a long war of attrition, with Germany defending every position and constantly retreating in the face of Allied superiority in men and materiel, was becoming increasingly clear. The German High Command was locked in complex debates about strategy and logistics. And yet, parallel to these official discussions, informal conversations were beginning to occur among some German officers and officials. What if the war could not be won? What if the best outcome Germany could hope for was some negotiated settlement that would stop the bloodshed and allow Germany to survive as a state, even if not as the master of Europe? Such conversations were treasonous, of course, by the strict standards of the Nazi regime, and yet they were beginning to occur among men who had been loyal to Germany and to the regime, who had risen through its ranks, and who were now facing the possibility that their loyalty might lead Germany and themselves toward destruction. For Karl Wolff, in his headquarters in northern Italy, these converging currents began to create possibilities that would have been unthinkable just months before. The military situation was deteriorating. The Italian theatre had demonstrated that German authority, while formidable, was not absolute and could be contested. Mussolini's restoration had failed to revive Italian enthusiasm for continued war. And most significantly, Wolff was beginning to understand that his position in Italy, his semi-autonomous role as Himmler's representative in a distant theatre, created what might be called operational freedom. In Berlin, he had been embedded in a rigid hierarchy of command and ideology. In Italy, he had more room for independent action, more ability to interpret his orders in light of changing circumstances, more potential to consider options that might not be explicitly authorized from Berlin. This was the psychological and political space in which the events of the next 18 months would unfold. This was the moment when Karl Wolff began, almost unconsciously at first, to consider whether there might be alternatives to absolute loyalty to a sinking regime. Italy had changed him, or at least had created the conditions in which change might become possible. The collapse of Italian fascism in September 1943 sent shockwaves through the Nazi hierarchy. Mussolini, the man who had walked alongside Hitler as an equal, was stripped of power by his own people and arrested by the Italian king. The entire southern flank of Fortress Europe, as Hitler envisioned it, had crumbled in mere weeks. Rome fell to the Allies. The Italian peninsula, which should have been a bastion of Axis strength, became instead a swirling chaos of conflicting allegiances, occupying armies, and fractured authority. In this moment of crisis, when Berlin needed someone to impose order with an iron hand, Heinrich Himmler turned to the one man he trusted absolutely, Karl Wolff. By late 1943, Wolff received his posting as higher SS and police leader for occupied Italy and commander of all German SS forces in the Italian theatre. It was a promotion that would transform him from a shadow figure in Berlin into something far more dangerous, an autonomous power broker with the ability to make decisions that Berlin itself could not easily reverse. The geography of Italy in 1943 was not the geography of a nation under unified control. The southern half, from Naples downward, was rapidly falling under Allied control as American and British forces advanced northward. The centre and north remained under German occupation, though the definition of occupation had become complicated by the Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's puppet state, hastily reconstructed under German sponsorship in the territories Italy still nominally controlled. This was Wolff's domain. His headquarters were established in northern Italy, particularly in the region around Milan and the Alpine territories that bordered Switzerland. From his command posts, Wolff controlled approximately 400,000 German troops, along with Italian fascist militia and security forces that answered to the puppet government. But control in occupied Italy was never as absolute as it appeared on a map drawn in Berlin. Partisan movements were growing in the mountains and forests. The local population was increasingly hostile to German occupation. The Italian government, even under Mussolini's restoration, maintained pretensions of sovereignty that frequently clashed with German military necessity. Wolff's task was to hold this powder keg together while somehow answering to Berlin, which was increasingly consumed with its own catastrophic situation on the Eastern Front. What made Wolff's position unique was the degree of autonomy it granted him. Unlike his previous role as Himmler's adjutant in Berlin, where he operated in the shroud of his superior and executed orders passed down from above, Wolff now made independent decisions that could not be easily second-guessed by Berlin. The distance was not merely geographic, but political. The Italian theatre was peripheral to Hitler's obsession with Russia. Communications with Berlin were slower, less immediate, and less intrusive than in previous postings. German military commanders in Italy, generals who had fought in France and North Africa, represented a different power structure than the SS hierarchy. They were professional soldiers, not ideological fanatics, and they were increasingly skeptical about Germany's ability to win the war. Wolff had to negotiate with these commanders, balance their concerns against SS interests, and maintain a facade of unified German authority even as the underlying tensions grew more pronounced with each passing month. The result was that Wolff acquired something that had been unthinkable during his Berlin years: real power, independent authority, and the ability to shape events rather than merely execute orders from above. The Italian Social Republic itself presented a peculiar challenge to any German commander. Mussolini, rescued from captivity by a daring German operation in September 1943, was restored as the nominal head of state in territories still under German control. But Mussolini, in 1943, was a shroud of the man who had once stood beside Hitler as an equal. He was broken, dependent, and increasingly detached from reality. More importantly, he was dependent on German military support for his regime's very existence. Wolff's authority over the SS forces in Italy meant that he wielded enormous influence over Mussolini's government. The Duce could not make major decisions without tacit German approval, and that approval had to pass through Wolff's office. The Italian fascists wanted to pursue policies of nationalist reconstruction, trying to salvage some form of Italian sovereignty and credibility among the Italian people. The Germans wanted to exploit Italy as a resource, a defensive line, and a buffer against Allied advances. Wolff found himself mediating between these incompatible visions, constantly managing the tensions between Italian aspirations and German military imperatives. It was a delicate dance, and it taught Wolff lessons about political manipulation and independent decision-making that would serve him well in the months ahead. The machinery of occupation that Wolff commanded was vast and terrible in its reach. The SS forces under his authority included security police, military police, and intelligence units tasked with suppressing partisan activity, managing Italian security forces, and extracting resources for the German war effort. The concentration camps that existed in occupied Italy, including the notorious San Vittore and other facilities, ultimately answered to Wolff's authority structure, though the daily operations might be delegated to subordinates. Thousands of Italian partisans and political prisoners passed through these camps. Thousands more were executed without trial. Jews remaining in Italy faced arrest and deportation to camps in the north, or to Auschwitz itself. All of this occurred under the umbrella of Wolff's command authority. He may not have personally ordered each execution or signed each deportation warrant, but the system functioned under his watch and with his knowledge. This is the uncomfortable reality that shadows Wolff's entire period in Italy. Here was a man ascending toward independent power at precisely the moment when that power would be most visibly, most directly, and most personally implicated in atrocity. The Nazi machinery did not pause in 1943 or 1944. It continued to function, to kill and to destroy, now under the command of someone who would later claim to have harbored doubts about the Nazi regime all along. Yet the very autonomy and distance that made Wolff's position powerful also created the conditions for something else, the possibility of seeing beyond the immediate demands of Nazi ideology. In Berlin, surrounded by the Reich's machinery of power and the constant reinforcement of Nazi doctrine, one could exist in a bubble of rationalization and denial. In Italy, Wolff encountered a different reality. He saw the Italian population's hostility toward German occupation. He witnessed the growing strength of partisan movements and understood that conventional military means alone could not suppress them indefinitely. He observed that Germany was losing the war. The evidence was written in every incoming intelligence report, every casualty figure, every map of territorial loss on the Eastern Front. Most importantly, he operated in a theater where other actors existed with their own interests and agendas. American and British forces were advancing slowly but relentlessly. Swiss intelligence services operated across the Italian borders. The Vatican maintained its own diplomatic channels. Italian military leaders and administrators had contacts with the Allies. The monopoly of power that the Nazis could enforce in Berlin or in the concentration camps could not be sustained in Italy. There were other conversations happening, other possibilities being explored, and gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, Wolff became aware that the future might hold alternatives to the apocalyptic Nazi vision of total victory or total destruction. The winter of 1943 and the spring of 1944 marked the beginning of a subtle shift in Wolff's thinking. Though it would be years before he fully articulated it, he began to associate more frequently with other German military and administrative figures in Italy who shared his growing conviction that the war was unwinnable. These were not wild-eyed conspirators or committed anti-Nazi resistors. They were pragmatists, military professionals who understood logistics, manpower, and strategic reality. They were administrators who had to manage the actual occupation of a hostile territory and understood the difference between ideological fantasy and practical governance. Conversations grew more frank as 1944 progressed. There was talk, cautious and careful, about what might happen if Germany could negotiate its way out of the war in the south. What if Italian forces could be withdrawn or neutralized? What if the advance of the Allies could be slowed through negotiated arrangement rather than futile military resistance? What if Germany could preserve at least some semblance of order and organization in retreat rather than facing complete collapse? These conversations never directly challenged Nazi ideology or Hitler's authority in these early stages. Rather, they were framed in practical terms: how to preserve German soldiers' lives, how to maintain order in occupied territory, how to ensure that the inevitable transition would occur in the most orderly fashion possible. Wolff's position as the highest SS authority in Italy gave him something invaluable: the ability to act. Unlike military commanders who had to answer to the German high command, Wolff's authority derived from the SS hierarchy, and the SS had always been more autonomous, more independent in its decision-making, and more willing to act on its own initiative than the conventional military structure. Himmler, Wolff's patron, was distant in Berlin, but not entirely unavailable to consultation. More importantly, Himmler in 1944 was himself beginning to harbor doubts about Germany's trajectory. The intelligence networks that Wolff controlled gave him information that Berlin did not always receive, or received too late. He had direct access to Italian sources, partisan intelligence, American intelligence intercepts, and reports from German commanders in the field. He could assess the military situation in Italy with a clarity that was difficult to achieve from Berlin, and as 1944 progressed, that assessment grew increasingly clear. Germany could not hold Italy indefinitely. The question was not whether to surrender, but when, and under what terms, and through whose negotiation. What made Wolff's position extraordinary was that he had two distinct audiences and could move between them without either fully understanding his actions. To Berlin, to Himmler, to Hitler's representatives in Italy, Wolff was the loyal SS commander, firmly committed to holding Italian territory, suppressing partisan movements, and maintaining German authority. He conducted no conspicuous negotiations or public contacts with the Allies. He arrested anti-Nazi resistors and executed partisans. He maintained the apparatus of SS terror and control. His reports to Berlin were carefully crafted to suggest that the situation was manageable, that German forces were adequate to their task, that the partisan threat could be contained. At the same time, Wolff was becoming increasingly aware of other possibilities, other conversations, other channels through which information and proposals could flow. Switzerland, separated from occupied Italy by the Alps, was neutral territory and therefore accessible through legitimate channels. The Vatican, also technically independent from German-occupied territory, maintained diplomatic functions. Swiss intelligence services had contacts with German officers. American intelligence agencies were actively seeking German contacts who might provide information or facilitate negotiations. Wolff was positioned to be precisely the kind of contact these services sought, senior in authority, with real power to make binding decisions, and increasingly doubtful about Germany's future. By early 1944, Wolff had begun to receive what might be characterized as feelers, discreet communications suggesting that conversations between German authorities and the Allies might be possible. These came through intermediaries, through Swiss business contacts, through channels that could be denied if necessary. Wolff did not rush to respond, but he did not shut the door either. Instead, he began what would become a characteristic pattern, exploring possibilities while maintaining absolute deniability, probing the limits of what might be negotiated while never committing himself irreversibly to any course of action. The beauty of this approach, from Wolff's perspective, was that it allowed him to serve multiple masters simultaneously. He could remain outwardly loyal to Berlin while quietly investigating what alternatives might exist. He could gather intelligence about Allied intentions while maintaining his authority over German forces. He could explore the possibility of negotiated settlement while continuing to execute orders to maintain German control. It was a high-wire act that required extraordinary skill, constant vigilance, and an almost inhuman ability to compartmentalize his thoughts and actions. But Wolff had spent his entire career acquiring precisely these skills. The world of German military authority in Italy in 1944 was fragmented and factious in ways that actually worked to Wolff's advantage. The German military commander, responsible for conventional operations and troop movements, was General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, a professional officer who was increasingly convinced that Germany could not win the war. Other senior commanders, General Joachim Mamelock, who commanded SS forces, and various military governors, represented competing power centers and competing visions of German strategy in Italy. There was no single unified German authority in Italy, as there might be elsewhere. Instead, there was a careful balance of power among military, SS, and administrative authorities, each checking the others, each holding pieces of the overall picture. This fragmentation meant that Wolff could pursue his own agenda without immediate exposure to complete German hierarchy. A proposal that might have been immediately denounced in Berlin as defeatism could be discussed in Italy as strategic planning. A contact with potential negotiators that would have been immediately reported in some other context could be carefully managed in the Italian theatre. The very complexity of the occupation structure created spaces in which alternative thinking could develop, spaces in which a clever and ambitious man could maneuver and probe without immediate catastrophic exposure. Wolff's growing autonomy in Italy also reflected a broader reality about Nazi authority in 1944. Berlin was increasingly preoccupied with catastrophe, the Soviet advances in the East, the Allied invasion of France in June 1944, the collapse of the German position on multiple fronts. Hitler was becoming more isolated, more prone to rage, less capable of coherent decision-making. Himmler was increasingly focused on securing his own position as Germany's trajectory became more obviously toward defeat. The SS itself was fragmenting, with various senior commanders beginning to pursue their own agendas and make their own preparations for a potential post-Nazi future. In this environment of disintegrating central authority, provincial power centers acquired more autonomy. Wolff in Italy was not alone in beginning to think independently about his own future and Germany's trajectory. Other SS leaders were making similar calculations. Other military commanders were exploring similar possibilities. The Nazi state in 1944 was not a monolithic entity, but a collection of competing power centers, each trying to preserve itself and position itself advantageously for the future. Wolff's activities in this context were not aberrations, but rather extreme manifestations of broader patterns that were beginning to emerge throughout the German power structure. As 1944 progressed and became 1945, Wolff's position in northern Italy had transformed him from an adjutant and administrator into something far more significant, a semi-independent power broker with the ability to shape the future of the Italian theatre and potentially influence Germany's own trajectory toward defeat and surrender. He controlled hundreds of thousands of troops. He commanded the SS security and intelligence apparatus in a critical theatre. He maintained communication with Berlin, while increasingly aware that Berlin was losing its grip on reality and strategy. He had begun to explore alternatives, to test possibilities, to position himself for a future that he could not quite articulate, but which he sensed routine. In the winter of 1944, the certainty that had sustained Karl Wolff through a decade of Nazi service began to fracture. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the quiet spaces between official duties, in whispered conversations with trusted colleagues, in the careful reading of intelligence reports from the Eastern Front, in the knowledge that the Reich's military position had shifted from inevitable victory to managed catastrophe. Italy itself had become a proving ground for a man learning to question the architecture of his own ambitions. The Italian Social Republic, the puppet state he commanded, was not a glorious seat of power, but a stage for witnessing the collapse of order. German troops bled into the winter mud. The Allies advanced yard by yard. And somewhere in the complexity of that deteriorating situation, Wolff began to imagine an alternative to the ending that seemed to await all loyal Nazis. The precise moment when calculation became conspiracy is difficult to pinpoint, but by early 1944, Wolff had begun his first tentative contact with the other side. The mechanism was necessarily oblique. Direct approach would have meant certain death, not merely his own, but the elimination of his family, his closest associates, anyone who might have been touched by his betrayal. So contact came through intermediaries, through carefully chosen channels that provided deniability. One of those channels ran through the Vatican. In Rome, the German SS commander could reach through diplomatic and religious networks toward men who represented Swiss and American interests. These were not chance encounters but structured conversations with plausible surfaces. A businessman here, an ecclesiastical figure there, each with their own reasons for wanting to know what a high-ranking SS officer might be willing to discuss. The Swiss businessman, who became one of Wolff's crucial contacts, was a man of pragmatic intelligence rather than ideological fervor. He operated in the space between German occupation and Allied advance, with the practiced neutrality that only Switzerland's status allowed. Through him, Wolff transmitted the essential message: the senior SS commander in Italy was willing to explore possibilities. Not surrender. That word was forbidden to even think aloud. Not betrayal of the Führer. That phrase would have brought Gestapo assassins within hours. But alternatives, solutions, ways that the inevitable ending might be managed with less bloodshed and more dignity for the men under his command. The businessman carried these conversations toward men in Switzerland who represented American and British interests. The network was delicate, each node separated from the others by necessity, each participant carefully chosen for their ability to keep dangerous secrets. The American Office of Strategic Services, by early 1944, had become expert in exactly this kind of intelligence work. They operated in Switzerland through various covers and under various names, but their essential mission was to understand Germany's fractures and to exploit them. When reports began arriving that Karl Wolff, of all people, was making overtures, the response was serious attention mixed with understandable skepticism. Wolff was not a minor functionary or an anti-Nazi true believer. He was one of Himmler's closest men, a central figure in the apparatus of control that had made the SS the most feared organization in Europe. Why would such a man begin secret conversations with the enemy, and how could he be trusted? The answer, as it often is in intelligence work, was that his trustworthiness was irrelevant. What mattered was that he was making contact, that he claimed to represent a significant military force in a crucial theater, and that he might be useful regardless of his true motives. Allen Dulles, the American intelligence chief in Switzerland, understood this calculus well. He was not naive enough to believe in sudden redemptions or last-minute conversions to democracy. He believed in leverage, in understanding what men wanted and what they feared, in separating what was useful in their information from the corrupted vessel that carried it. When Wolff's initial overtures reached him, Dulles recognized opportunity. Here was someone who could potentially influence German military decisions in Italy, someone with command authority over significant forces, someone who, for whatever combination of reasons, seemed willing to imagine a future beyond unconditional Nazi surrender. The conversations began with extraordinary caution. Messages were encoded and decoded. Meetings were arranged in neutral territory where neither party was entirely safe, which was precisely the point. Danger created honesty more reliably than trust. The first substantive conversations appear to have taken place through ecclesiastical intermediaries in Rome and Vatican channels, though the exact dates remain obscured by the deliberate vagueness of all parties involved. Wolff could claim, if questioned, that he was conducting counterintelligence operations against supposed Vatican espionage. The Americans and their allies could claim they were merely gathering intelligence on German intentions. The Vatican, as always, maintained its position of official neutrality while serving as a crucial communication hub for the powers circling the dying Reich. What was discussed in these early conversations was testing, not treaty-making. Wolff was presenting himself as a man who understood military reality. Germany could not win. Everyone with access to casualty figures and production statistics knew this. By 1944, the question was not victory, but how to minimize the destruction of what remained. If the Italian theater could be managed differently, if the bloodshed there could be reduced, perhaps that would create space for other considerations. What Wolff was proposing, without quite saying it in words that could be repeated in writing, was this: the German forces in Italy could cease fighting. They could do so either through an orderly negotiated surrender or through a collapse of command authority that no one would quite take responsibility for. The result would be the preservation of the Italian campaign as a relatively contained military operation rather than a world of destruction. Tens of thousands of lives might be spared: German soldiers, Italian civilians, Allied troops. And in exchange, Wolff would need certain assurances that he would not be immediately prosecuted for his role in the SS, that his family would be protected, that he would be treated as a soldier who had made a difficult decision at a moment of historical necessity, not as a war criminal awaiting trial and execution. These were enormous demands, and yet they were not entirely unreasonable to the American intelligence officer who was already considering how post-war Europe would be organized. The delicate game that Wolff was now playing required extraordinary compartmentalization. In Italy, he remained the effective dictator of occupied territories, commanding SS forces with the same authority he had wielded before the conversations began. He attended military briefings. He enforced Nazi discipline. He upheld the forms of loyalty to Berlin that kept him alive. His communications with Himmler remained apparently unchanged. Meanwhile, in the shadows, he was having conversations with enemy intelligence services about the terms on which he might cease being an enemy at all. This was not hypocrisy in the conventional sense. though it was that too. It was rather the condition of survival for someone who believed the Reich's end was certain and who wanted to ensure that his own end was not equally certain. The compartmentalization required was mental as well as logistical. Wolff needed to maintain his belief in his own righteousness. Even as he negotiated with men he would have denounced as traitors if the situation were reversed. The question that historians have never fully resolved is whether Wolff was acting as an independent agent or whether he was operating with some degree of knowledge or tacit approval from Himmler. By early 1944, Himmler himself had begun to entertain doubts about the Nazi future. He had begun his own explorations toward peace through Swedish contacts and other channels. It is possible, though perhaps not provable, that Himmler knew Wolff was conducting these conversations and allowed them to continue. It is even possible that Himmler encouraged them, seeing in Wolff's actions a kind of insurance policy, a way of testing whether negotiations might be possible without committing himself directly until the moment became necessary. The relationship between Himmler and Wolff, by this point in the war, had transcended normal military hierarchy. They were partners in knowledge, men who understood things that could not be discussed aloud, who communicated through implications and silences. What Wolff was testing through these early conversations was whether the Allies would even be interested in negotiating with a German military officer, no matter how senior. The answer, it turned out, was qualified yes. Yes, they were interested. Yes, they would listen. No, they would not offer formal terms that could be binding. Yes, they would consider protecting him afterward. No, they could not guarantee that he would not face some kind of prosecution. These ambiguous responses were precisely what Wolff needed to hear. They meant the conversations could continue. They meant there was space to maneuver. They meant that the future, though surely difficult, was not entirely written. In the Swiss meetings, and through the various intermediaries, Wolff was learning to inhabit a new role, not the loyal Nazi administrator, not yet the collaborator with the Allies, but something in between, a man positioning himself for survival in a world that was collapsing, a man whose knowledge of the machinery of Nazi power made him valuable to those who would soon be occupying Germany and Italy. The spring of 1944 was still relatively early in these conversations. Wolff was feeling his way forward, testing responses, learning who could be trusted and what was possible. He had not yet made any commitment that could not be denied. He had not yet proposed specific surrender terms or concrete military arrangements. He was still in the realm of possibility rather than action. But the direction was set. The conversations had begun. The man who had served as Himmler's shadow, who had walked through the halls of power in Berlin as one of the most feared figures in Nazi governance, was beginning a slow pivot toward the other side. Not out of moral clarity, not out of sudden recognition of Nazi evil, though he may have experienced some measure of both, but out of clear-eyed calculation that the system he had served was ending and that his own survival depended on his ability to be useful to whoever came next. The conversations that had begun in the winter of 1944 would accelerate through the spring, would become more explicit through the summer, and would eventually lead to negotiations that might genuinely alter the course of the Italian campaign. But that was still ahead. For now, in early 1944, Karl Wolff was simply planting seeds, testing ground, preparing for the possibility that everything he had built his life around might need to be abandoned. By early 1944, Karl Wolff stood at the intersection of two competing realities. On one side lay the rigid structure of the Third Reich, where loyalty was a currency measured in blood, and obedience was the only acceptable language. On the other side lay a world that was collapsing into itself, a world where German victories had stopped coming where Soviet tanks rolled westward with unstoppable momentum, where the Atlantic Wall stood vulnerable to an invasion everyone knew was coming. Wolff, now commanding all SS forces in Italy and much of occupied northern Europe, understood something that many in Berlin had not yet fully grasped. The war was not going to end in German triumph. The question was no longer how to win, but how to survive what came next. From his headquarters in northern Italy, Wolff began the most dangerous choreography of his life, a dance that required him to maintain absolute authority as a loyal Nazi commander, while simultaneously reaching out to men who wanted him dead. The channels through which Wolff began to communicate were neither obvious nor direct. In occupied Italy, the traditional structures of power had fractured. Mussolini's Italian Social Republic, the puppet state that Germany propped up after the Italian collapse, existed in a state of perpetual tension with German military command. The Vatican still maintained diplomatic infrastructure and had not been bombed into irrelevance like so many European capitals. Switzerland remained neutral, its banks and its intelligence services maintaining contact with parties on both sides of the conflict. These spaces, the gaps between absolute German control, became Wolff's avenue. He did not simply appear in an American office and announce his intentions. Instead, he worked through intermediaries, through people who had legitimate reasons to communicate across borders, through the kind of careful architecture of contact that left no single point of discovery that could be traced directly back to him. A businessman here, a Vatican official there, a Swiss intelligence contact with divided loyalties. The network grew slowly and with immense caution. Allen Dulles represented something new in American intelligence. Unlike many in the American military and civilian leadership, Dulles understood that wars did not end in neat, decisive moments captured in photographs. They ended in negotiations, in back-channel communications, in the subtle recognition by one side that the other side had knowledge and leverage that could not be simply eliminated by force. Stationed in Bern as the chief of the American Office of Strategic Services station in Switzerland, Dulles had spent months cultivating contacts throughout the fractured Nazi empire. He understood the difference between intelligence gathering and possibility, the difference between knowing that a German officer had doubts and actually being able to convert those doubts into action. When Wolff's first tentative overtures reached him, Dulles recognized what they represented, not necessarily a sudden conversion to anti-Nazi virtue, but rather the emergence of a practical calculation that staying loyal to Berlin might be less advantageous than exploring alternatives. For Dulles, that was enough. Calculations could be worked with. They had clarity and weight in ways that sudden moral transformations often did not. Wolff's first communications were deliberately vague. He did not offer to surrender. He did not promise to betray the Reich's military secrets. Instead, he spoke of his concern for the civilian population of Italy, of his dismay at unnecessary destruction, of his belief that certain military objectives had become impossible to achieve and therefore should be reconsidered. In messages conveyed through intermediaries, Wolff painted himself as a pragmatist rather than a conspirator, a man who saw clearly what others refused to acknowledge, and who believed that reasonable men could find reasonable solutions to impossible situations. These messages had to be crafted with extraordinary precision. They could not be so enthusiastic in their anti-Nazi sentiment that they became obvious forgeries if intercepted. They could not contain information so valuable that German counterintelligence would suspect Wolff of passing secrets. Instead, they had to sound like the private reflections of a man caught in an untenable position, a man thinking out loud to an unknown listener, testing whether that listener might be interested in a conversation. It was espionage conducted at the speed of thoughtfulness rather than urgency. Throughout 1944, These contacts intensified without ever becoming reckless. Wolff maintained his full command authority in Italy. He issued orders in Hitler's name. He overseen German military operations against the advancing Allies. He maintained the fiction of absolute loyalty to the regime, while simultaneously exploring what the world might look like when that regime no longer existed. The duality required constant vigilance. Every message sent through Switzerland had to be reviewed for language that might be interpreted by Berlin as defeatism, or worse, as active negotiation with the enemy. Every contact had to be maintained at a level of distance that made it difficult to prove conspiracy if discovered. Wolff could never be seen traveling to Switzerland. He could never be discovered in a room full of American officers. Instead, he existed in the grey zone between suspicion and certainty, maintaining plausible deniability while moving steadily toward deeper commitment to the possibility of negotiated surrender. What made Wolff's position even more precarious was the question of what his superiors might know or suspect. Himmler, as we have already seen in these chronicles, was himself beginning to entertain doubts about German victory. But Himmler's doubts took a different form than Wolff's. Where Wolff was exploring specific military solutions in a specific theater, Himmler was beginning to imagine himself as the potential architect of a new German state, one that could negotiate directly with the Western powers. Wolff had to navigate not only the absolute loyalty that Berlin demanded, but also the possibility that Himmler himself might be engaged in parallel negotiations. This created a situation of profound ambiguity. Was Wolff acting with tacit approval from his superior? Was he exceeding his authority? Could he trust that if discovered, Himmler would protect him, or would Himmler disavow him as a rogue subordinate to prove his own continued loyalty to Hitler? The answers to these questions were never entirely clear, and that uncertainty was part of the calculated risk. The Americans, for their part, faced their own complexity in dealing with Wolff. To accept his overtures was to legitimize a man who had been intimately involved in the apparatus of Nazi control. Wolff had coordinated SS operations across multiple occupied territories. He had signed documents that put him in the chain of command for some of the machinery of mass killing. To treat with him at all was, in some sense, to compromise with that machinery. And yet, if Wolff could deliver German surrender in Italy without additional bloodshed, without the costly campaign northward through the Alps that military planners had been forced to contemplate, then that compromise had a concrete value measured in lives. This tension between moral principle and practical outcome haunted every conversation about Wolff conducted in Bern and in Washington. Some American officials believed that engaging with Wolff was pragmatic necessity in the midst of total war. Others believed it was a betrayal of the very values that the Allies claimed to be fighting for. Dulles navigated between these positions by focusing on the specifics of what Wolff could deliver, rather than engaging in broader philosophical debates about whether he deserved to be negotiated with at all. By the middle of 1944, Wolff began proposing concrete terms. He suggested that German forces in Italy might be persuaded to cease active resistance if certain conditions were met. He hinted that he might be able to convince military commanders under his authority to lay down their weapons rather than continue a futile defense of terrain that could not be held indefinitely. He raised the possibility that if the Allies granted certain guarantees regarding the treatment of German soldiers and officers who surrendered, the calculus facing German commanders might shift dramatically. These proposals existed in a state of suspended reality. They were not official. They could not be. Wolff held no authority to negotiate on behalf of the Reich. Any proposal he made was technically an act of treason, and yet the proposals were also not mere fantasy. They represented genuine conversations with German military officers who were themselves grappling with questions of what loyalty meant when the cause was lost. They reflected actual possibilities in the Italian theatre, where the military situation had become increasingly untenable for Germany. What emerged from these months of careful communication was something neither pure negotiation nor pure espionage. It was instead a kind of rehearsal for surrender, a testing of the terrain that might be crossed when the moment came. Wolff was building relationships with American intelligence that could be activated when the political circumstances in Berlin became desperate enough. He was establishing himself as a known quantity to men like Dulles, someone whose word had been tested against reality and who had proven capable of moving beyond the rhetoric of absolute loyalty. He was simultaneously building a record of his own voice, offering alternatives, creating a foundation that could be pointed to after the war as evidence of his complicated position. Whether this was consciousness of a man preparing an alibi or consciousness of a man genuinely seeking a better outcome is a question that historians have never fully resolved. The answer may be that he was doing both at the same time, preparing for his own survival while simultaneously recognizing that continuing the war when surrender was possible meant condemning more men to death. The delicate equilibrium Wolff maintained through 1944 depended on Berlin's continued uncertainty about the progress of the war. As long as Hitler could convince himself that miraculous weapons or strategic reversals might still occur, as long as Himmler could imagine scenarios in which Nazi power might be preserved in some form, Wolff could continue his careful exploration of alternatives without drawing fatal suspicion. The moment Berlin recognized surrender as inevitable, rather than merely possible, that equilibrium would become unstable. Wolff understood this. It was why his communications with the Americans remained measured and exploratory, rather than urgent and definitive. It was why he never committed himself to actions that would constitute open treason until the moment when open treason became the only path to survival. He was threading a needle while standing on a wire in a room where the walls were closing in. One mistake would be fatal. A discovery of his contacts would mean death from Berlin. A too obvious commitment to surrender before circumstances demanded it would mean abandonment by the Germans and capture by the Allies as a war criminal. The only path forward lay in maintaining perfect balance until the moment when perfect balance became impossible. By the autumn of 1944, Wolff had established himself as a reliable channel for communication between the Allies and certain elements of the German military in Italy. He had proven that he could speak authoritatively about German capabilities and intentions. He had demonstrated that he understood the situation clearly enough to articulate to his American interlocutors what the German military leadership in Italy might accept or reject. He had built enough trust that when he sent messages suggesting that surrender was possible under certain circumstances, those messages were taken seriously by men in positions to act on them. And yet, he had maintained his public position as a loyal Nazi commander, issuing orders in Hitler's name, maintaining discipline in his forces, presenting the face of unwavering commitment to the German cause. This duality, performing loyalty while preparing betrayal, was not unique to Wolff, but he performed it with a particular skill born from years of navigating the treacherous corridors of Nazi power. He had learned from Himmler the art of maintaining authority while keeping one's actual beliefs obscure. Now he was deploying that art in service of a very different objective. The stage was being set for the final act of his wartime career. Berlin did not yet know it, but the machinery of German defeat in Italy had been set in motion by the man who commanded it. #Chapter 13. Himmler's Parallel Dreams. By the autumn of 1944, the architecture of the Third Reich was visibly crumbling. The Red Army had crossed into Poland. The Western Allies pushed toward the Rhine. German cities burned under sustained aerial bombardment. And yet, at the center of power, something unexpected began to happen. Not capitulation, not acceptance of inevitable defeat. Rather, a peculiar kind of hedging, a slow, careful repositioning by men who had built their authority on absolute certainty. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, architect of the concentration camp system and orchestrator of mass murder, began to entertain a thought that would have seemed treasonous mere months before. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to survive what was coming. Perhaps there was a way to step back from the edge. The man who had once declared absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler started, in secret, to explore the opposite. Through intermediaries in Sweden, Swedish diplomats, Red Cross officials, German refugees with Stockholm connections, Himmler began to send feelers toward the Western Allies. These were not official negotiations. They were whispers, shadows within shadows. The Reichsführer SS, still commanding millions, still directing the apparatus of terror, was asking a simple but dangerous question. What if we were to sue for peace? What if the SS, acting with autonomy, could negotiate directly with the British and Americans without the knowledge of the Führer? The absurdity of the proposition that a man so deeply implicated in genocide could simply step away seemed not to occur to him, or perhaps it did, and he calculated that his technical expertise, his organizational genius, his knowledge of intelligence matters made him valuable enough to survive what others would not. Karl Wolff, working in Italy, gradually became aware of what his superior was attempting. The channels were separate, the contacts were different. Himmler was operating through Swedish businessman Count Folke Bernadotte, through Red Cross contacts, through his own intelligence networks that operated parallel to the SS command structure. Wolff's own negotiations with Allen Dulles and American intelligence were proceeding through different pathways entirely, through Swiss intermediaries, through the Vatican, through careful arrangements that left plausible deniability at every turn. And yet, both men were moving in the same direction. Both were testing the possibility of a negotiated way out. The difference was subtle but crucial. Wolff was working from Italy, a theatre where German military authority was weakening, where the Allies were advancing, where some form of accommodation might emerge organically from circumstance. Himmler was working from Berlin, from the center of power, attempting to position himself as the reasonable alternative to the Führer's fanaticism. What emerged between them, unspoken, and therefore all the more powerful, was something approaching understanding. Wolff learned what Himmler was doing. Himmler, through his network of informants, would have known what Wolff was doing. Yet neither man directly confronted the other. Neither demanded cessation. Instead, there existed an implicit arrangement, perhaps the most damning form of complicity. If Wolff's peace initiatives in Italy succeeded, they could be presented to Himmler as regional military necessity, a commander in the field making pragmatic decisions to minimize casualties. If Himmler's peace approaches through Sweden succeeded, Wolff's negotiations could be subordinated to a larger framework, a grander design emerging from the very top of SS authority. Each man covered the other, not through explicit coordination, but through the shared understanding of men who recognized that the old ways of thinking were becoming obsolete, and that survival required flexibility. There was also, beneath the surface, a matter of stakes and visibility. Wolff, commanding SS forces in Italy, could potentially offer something concrete to the Allies: German troops under his command, territory he controlled, a surrender that would stop the fighting in a specific geographic area. Himmler, attempting to orchestrate a broader peace, was offering something far more ambitious and far more dangerous to the Führer: the defection of the entire SS apparatus, the security services, the intelligence networks. This was not negotiation over a regional theatre. This was a coup dressed in the language of pragmatism. Himmler was positioning himself not merely as a subordinate seeking terms, but as an alternative centre of power. He was suggesting, delicately but unmistakably, that Germany could survive Nazism if it abandoned Hitler. The SS, properly motivated, could engineer a smooth transition to a post-Nazi order. Himmler would facilitate this. He would offer his expertise, his networks, his intelligence assets, and in return, he would be treated as a major player in whatever came next. The psychological dimensions of this moment deserve consideration. Himmler was a man who had spent years constructing an elaborate mythology around himself: the SS as an elite order, a racial brotherhood, a force for historical renewal. He had rationalized, in his own mind, the genocide as historical necessity. He had written speeches justifying mass killing as a burden borne by superior men for the sake of civilization. And yet, by late 1944, something in that mythology was collapsing, not the ideology itself. Himmler never renounced his racial theories, but the certainty that supported them. If the racial state was truly superior, why was it losing? If the SS was truly an elite, why could it not reverse the military tide? The cognitive dissonance became intolerable, and the solution Himmler reached for was not introspection or moral reckoning. It was repositioning. He would survive by becoming useful to whoever won. He would shed the Nazi apparatus while retaining his power and prestige. He would position himself as a moderate, a pragmatist, a man who had always recognized the excesses of the regime and could now help bring them to an end. Wolff, in his Italian command, operated from a somewhat different psychological foundation. He was younger than Himmler, more removed from the earliest ideological fanaticism of the SS. His administrative work in Italy had exposed him to different ways of thinking, to Vatican officials, to Italian fascists, with their own complicated relationships to German control, to military commanders concerned with tactical rather than ideological matters. Italy was not Germany. The intensity of Nazi orthodoxy was diluted by distance and by the particular chaos of the Italian campaign. Wolff had room to maneuver, room to think, room to imagine alternatives. When he learned that his superior was also exploring alternatives, it would have been both reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring because it meant he was not alone in recognizing that the old certainties were finished. Unsettling because it meant that his own actions were no longer truly independent. They were part of a larger pattern, potentially subject to Himmler's designs. The historical record here becomes murky, which is itself significant. Did Himmler explicitly authorize Wolff's negotiations with the Allies? The evidence suggests not. Did Himmler tacitly understand and approve? This is more likely. Did Himmler himself harbor resentment toward Wolff, seeing in his subordinates' Italian initiatives a threat to his own negotiating position? Possibly. The absence of clear documentation is not accidental. These men communicated through intermediaries, through implication, through the kind of coded language that leaves no incriminating trace. Himmler sent no written order authorizing Wolff's peace talks. Wolff sent no written report to Berlin detailing his meetings with American intelligence representatives. The silence itself was the medium of communication. Each man understood that the other was moving in forbidden directions, and each calculated that maintaining plausible deniability served both of their interests. What made this arrangement morally abyssal was its foundation. Both Himmler and Wolff were men up to their necks in the machinery of genocide. Himmler had overseen the entire concentration camp apparatus. He had attended conferences where the mechanics of mass killing were discussed with bureaucratic precision. Wolff, as Himmler's chief of staff, had coordinated communications to killing units. He had signed off on logistics that supported extermination centers. He had trafficked in the euphemisms that allowed men to contemplate industrial murder without facing its reality directly. And now, these same men, comfortable with mass killing in the service of ideology, were maneuvering for survival by positioning themselves as men of peace and pragmatism. The hypocrisy was total, the moral corruption absolute, and yet, from a purely strategic perspective, their calculations were not entirely irrational. If Germany was going to lose, and by late 1944 this was becoming unavoidable, then survival required making oneself valuable to the victors. Confessing to genocide would be pointless. Demonstrating usefulness would work. Trading information, offering military cooperation, providing intelligence on the Soviet threat that everyone understood would emerge once Nazi Germany was defeated. These were the currency of post-war survival. By early 1945, when Himmler's Swedish negotiations had advanced to the point where Count Bernadotte was directly involved in discussions about German surrender, Wolff's position became more complicated. He was no longer simply a regional commander seeking accommodation in his theatre. He was now the subordinate of a man who was openly, if carefully, negotiating with the Western Allies at the highest level. Himmler's moves gave Wolff cover, but also subordinated his initiative to Himmler's larger design. If Himmler succeeded in negotiating a comprehensive German surrender through Sweden, Wolff's Italian theatre would be simply one piece of that larger arrangement. If Himmler failed, then Wolff's independent negotiations became more valuable, more significant. The dynamics between the two men shifted constantly, depending on which negotiating channel appeared to be yielding results. What emerges from this moment is not the image of two men secretly resisting evil from within. It is rather the image of ambitious survivors recognizing that their old masters were finished and calculating which new masters might value their skills. Wolff and Himmler were not heroes. They were not even reluctant participants in evil who had developed consciences. They were men who had built careers on the machinery of the regime, who understood that machine intimately, and who now sought to profit from its collapse. The moral ambiguity of their position is not accidental or superficial. It is structural. They were offering their knowledge, their organizational expertise, their intelligence networks, all derived from participation in the greatest crimes of the 20th century, as trade goods for survival in the post-war order. The Allies, particularly the Americans, would eventually accept this exchange. This would be one of the defining moral compromises of the early Cold War. The knowledge that Himmler himself was negotiating peace changed the entire tenor of Wolff's situation. It meant that his own activities, while still dangerous, were no longer quite so isolated. It meant that the SS hierarchy itself, at its highest level, had fractured into competing factions, each pursuing its own path to survival. It meant that the unified command structure that had seemed so permanent, so total, was actually composed of individuals with separate interests, making separate calculations. This realization would become crucial in the final months of the war, when Hitler's authority itself became unstable, when Berlin descended into confusion, and when the possibility of actually achieving what Wolff had been secretly negotiating became suddenly, shockingly real. The spring of 1945 arrived in Italy, as it always did, with the smell of warming earth and the sound of artillery that never truly ceased. But by this point, the nature of that sound had changed. The Germans were no longer advancing. They were holding, bleeding, and beginning to understand that their time was measured not in victories but in days. For Karl Wolff, standing in his headquarters in northern Italy, this reality had crystallized into a singular conviction: the war in Italy could end differently than it would end elsewhere. It did not have to end in the rubble of every town, in the death of every remaining soldier, in the slow grinding of armies until nothing remained but ash and grief. There was still a window, he believed, still a moment where reason might prevail. And he possessed something rare in the spring of 1945: access. Wolff commanded the SS and Wehrmacht forces across the Italian theatre. He answered to Berlin, but Berlin itself was descending into chaos. Hitler was no longer capable of rational command. The Red Army was advancing from the east like an unstoppable tide. And in this moment of accelerating collapse, Wolff saw something that others had not yet fully grasped. The Allies, particularly the Americans under the OSS, were listening. The proposition began, as these things often do, with whispers and intermediaries. Wolff had spent months now in careful communication with American and British intelligence services through back channels established in Switzerland. The Vatican had served as one conduit, its corridors providing shelter for conversations that officially could not occur. Swiss businessmen with connections on both sides of the conflict had served as messengers, but as spring arrived and the German position deteriorated with each passing week, Wolff moved beyond preliminary soundings into something far more direct. He began articulating a concrete possibility: a negotiated surrender of all German forces in Italy. Not a gradual retreat, not a negotiation for favorable treatment, but an actual formal laying down of arms in exchange for terms that might preserve some remnant of military honor and prevent what he termed the senseless extermination of men who had already lost the war. The appeal of this idea to American ears cannot be overstated. The Allies were preparing for what they feared would be a prolonged and bloody final campaign through the Alps and into the German heartland. Every day the war continued, men died. Every week that hostilities persisted, the Soviet sphere of influence expanded into territory the Western powers hoped to control, or at least negotiate over, after the guns fell silent. If Wolff could deliver the surrender of perhaps 400,000 to 500,000 German troops without further combat, it would not merely save lives, it would reshape the post-war European order. Wolff's meetings with Allied representatives occurred in Switzerland, a nation that managed to remain neutral despite existing entirely within the shroud of the Nazi Empire. Bern became the stage for these extraordinary negotiations. Wolff did not personally cross into Switzerland, a journey that would have been far too conspicuous, far too easily monitored. Instead, he sent trusted subordinates and met with American and British officers through secure channels. The American representative was Alan Dulles, the OSS station chief in Switzerland, a man who possessed both the authority to negotiate and the intelligence to understand what he was being offered. Dulles was no naive believer in the redemption of Nazi officers, but he was a pragmatist and a strategist. A negotiated surrender in Italy served American interests regardless of Wolff's true motivations. Dulles listened as Wolff's emissaries laid out the proposal. German forces in Italy would lay down their weapons. In exchange, they would receive terms that amounted essentially to becoming prisoners of war rather than casualties of combat. The Allies would gain what they wanted without the cost of another month or two of fierce mountain warfare. Wolff would gain something far less tangible, but perhaps more essential to a man contemplating the post-war world: the claim that he had used his power to prevent bloodshed rather than cause it. The practicalities of such a surrender required more than Wolff's authority alone. The German military in Italy, while operating under his command in some matters, included Wehrmacht officers who answered ultimately to the German High Command. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the senior German commander in Italy, would need to at least acquiesce to any surrender arrangement. The relationship between Wolff and Kesselring was complex. Kesselring was a soldier of the old school, a Prussian officer who had served before the Nazis and would, in many ways, continue serving after them. He was not an ideologue, but he was also not immediately predisposed to involve himself in negotiations with the enemy. Wolff, however, possessed advantages in influencing Kesselring. The SS commanded resources, security forces, and intelligence networks that the Wehrmacht depended upon. More subtly, Wolff represented a way for officers like Kesselring to exit the war with dignity intact. To surrender, when ordered to surrender, is one thing. To participate in negotiations that might spare tens of thousands of lives becomes something that could be preserved in memory, recast in the post-war years as an act of moral weight rather than mere defeat. Wolff also had to consider, with profound care, his relationship with Himmler. By the spring of 1945, the Reichsführer SS was himself engaged in secret negotiations with the Allies, approaching them through Swedish intermediaries in desperate attempts to forge a separate peace. This created an extraordinary situation. Wolff knew that his superior was also seeking to negotiate with the enemy. Himmler was attempting to portray himself as a potential ally against the Russians if only the Western powers would cease hostilities. It was a fantasy born of desperation, but it was Himmler's fantasy. Himmler had not explicitly authorized Wolff to negotiate a surrender in Italy, but he had not forbidden it either. There was, in the spaces between direct orders and acknowledgement, an implicit permission. Wolff understood that Himmler needed to maintain his public position as a loyal Nazi serving his Führer while privately exploring every possible exit from the catastrophe. Wolff was doing something similar. This was not a coincidence. The relationship between master and subordinate had evolved into something far more subtle than it had been in the years of Nazi triumph. They moved in tandem, pursuing parallel paths toward the same objective, survival, while maintaining the fiction of loyalty to a system that was visibly collapsing. The actual terms that Wolff proposed in the spring of 1945 were notably straightforward, given the context. German forces would lay down their weapons. Officers would be treated according to the Geneva Convention as prisoners of war. The process would occur over a specified time frame, allowing for orderly transition rather than chaotic dissolution. There would be no reprisals against German soldiers for their service. The Allies would receive the surrender without further loss of life. What Wolff sought in return was less a guarantee and more a historical record. He wanted it understood, documented, and preserved that he had initiated this surrender to prevent further bloodshed. He wanted his actions to be contrasted with the senseless slaughter that would continue elsewhere in Europe. He wanted the record to reflect that here, in Italy, war had been ended by reason rather than by attrition. It is difficult to assess with precision how much of this motivation was rooted in genuine horror at the scale of death he had been complicit in causing, and how much was rooted in calculated self-preservation. Likely, it was some admixture of both. Wolff had seen enough of war and mass death to understand their costs, but he was also pragmatic enough to understand that the post-war world would judge people like him, and he wanted to be judged as someone who had ultimately worked to reduce suffering rather than maximize it. The negotiations in Switzerland proceeded through the spring with a rhythm of hope and frustration. The Allies were deeply interested but cautious. They did not wish to appear to be negotiating with Nazi war criminals, and Wolff most surely was that by any objective measure. Yet he was also offering something of genuine strategic value. There were discussions of timing. When should the surrender occur? Should it happen simultaneously with the German collapse elsewhere? Or should Wolff move first, creating a demonstration effect that might inspire other surrenders? The logistics of such an operation were staggering. 400,000 men and all their equipment would not simply disappear. They would need to move, to be processed, to be detained. The Allies would need to position forces to receive them. Supplies would need to be arranged. The entire operation required the coordination of American forces, British forces, and German military commanders who would need to be brought into the conspiracy, at least partially, without the knowledge of the Nazi Party's security apparatus or the SS fanatics who might resist any surrender. Through all of these negotiations ran a current of moral ambiguity so profound that it would never be fully resolved. Wolff was proposing, in essence, to use his authority as a senior Nazi commander to end the war in his sector. That was not, in itself, a remarkable thing. The Russian fronts would see surrenders as the Soviet army advanced. French forces would see surrenders as their armies pushed into Germany. But Italy was different. Italy was not being invaded in the traditional sense. It was occupied territory where German forces held control. A negotiated surrender meant something far more deliberate and far more political than the mere collapse of a military unit under the pressure of enemy advance. It meant a conscious decision to stop fighting. It meant acting against Berlin's explicit orders to hold and defend. It meant using German military authority to make peace without the permission of the German government. And yet, from another angle, it also meant saving the lives of German soldiers who were going to die otherwise. It meant sparing Italian civilians further bombardment and occupation. It meant perhaps influencing the subsequent peace and the post-war order by creating a German commander who could be portrayed as reasonable, even far-sighted, willing to see the necessity of ending a lost war rather than prolonging it into apocalypse. By late spring of 1945, the negotiations had matured sufficiently that specific dates were being discussed. Wolff was communicating through channels now somewhat more direct with Dulles and his team. The Germans would surrender. The exact timing was still being worked out, but the principle was agreed. Wolff assured the Allies that the German military commanders in Italy would comply. He had cultivated relationships, found leverage, and created a consensus among the officer corps that surrender was preferable to annihilation. Some officers were motivated by the desire to avoid additional casualties. Some were motivated by the understanding that the war was already lost, and only the details of the ending remained to be settled. Some were motivated by fear of the Russians, understanding that a surrender to the Western Allies would mean detention as a prisoner of war in Western hands rather than capture by Soviet forces, which carried far grimmer implications. But whatever the mixture of motivations, Wolff had created a situation where a negotiated surrender was possible, even likely. The machinery was in motion. The end, when it came, would be orchestrated rather than chaotic. Lives would be saved, and Wolff would have his redemption story, or so he believed. The question that haunted the spring of 1945 was whether this redemption was genuine, or whether it was simply a more sophisticated version of complicity, a final administrative accomplishment by a man who had spent years ensuring that the machinery of Nazi power functioned smoothly. The answer, it seemed, would remain locked inside Wolff himself, along with all the secrets he carried toward whatever future awaited him. The spring of 1945 arrived in Europe, not with renewal, but with the sound of collapse. By April, the Third Reich existed in name alone. Soviet armies had crossed the Oder River and were closing on Berlin itself. American and British forces had breached the Rhine and swept deep into Western Germany. In Italy, the front lines remained relatively static, but everyone could read the calendar. Weeks remained, perhaps days. The question that consumed every German officer's mind was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how quickly, and what role they might play in the aftermath. Karl Wolff understood this mathematics better than most. His secret conversations with Alan Dulles and the American OSS had continued through the winter and into spring, growing bolder with each passing week. By early April, the negotiations had moved beyond theoretical discussion. Wolff was now discussing concrete terms for the surrender of German forces in Italy, a theatre command that represented roughly 1 million men under arms. This was no longer espionage or idle speculation. This was treason, in the eyes of Adolf Hitler and the regime Wolff had served for more than a decade. And on the 9th of April, the roof caved in. A coded message reached Hitler's headquarters. The source remains unclear, whether from German intelligence services, from a leak within the Wehrmacht command structure, or from some other vector of information. But the Führer learned that his senior SS commander in Italy had been conducting secret negotiations with the enemy. The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. Hitler's rage, documented in the accounts of those present at his headquarters, transcended even his considerable capacity for fury. To Hitler, this was the ultimate betrayal. This was his own SS, the organization that had sworn unconditional loyalty, now treating with the enemy behind his back. The man responsible was not some Wehrmacht general, those he dismissed as defeatists, but an SS officer, one of Himmler's own inner circle. This cut directly into the heart of the regime's mythology about National Socialist loyalty. Orders went out from Berlin with characteristic brutality. Wolff was to be arrested immediately. An SS execution squad was dispatched. The machinery that Wolff had helped construct, the system of absolute obedience and merciless punishment, was now turning toward him. In a bitter symmetry that no novelist would dare invent, the adjutant who had coordinated so much of the SS apparatus found himself marked for elimination by that very system. In Berlin, Heinrich Himmler received the news of his protégé's supposed betrayal. What Himmler thought in that moment remains one of history's genuine mysteries. Did he feel betrayed? Did he suspect that Wolff had been acting, at least in part, with tacit encouragement from his superior? The evidence suggests something far more complex than simple outrage. Wolff's situation in Italy in early April 1945 can be understood only by grasping the geography of power and communication that existed at that moment. He was in Italy, hundreds of kilometers away from Berlin. The German command structure in Italy was fractured between SS units under Wolff's control and Wehrmacht forces under General Heinrich von Vietinghoff. Allied armies were advancing from the south and the west. The Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's puppet state, existed in name only, its legitimacy hollow, its ability to command obedience dissipating by the day. Radio communication with Berlin was possible, but it was monitored and vulnerable. Travel was increasingly dangerous. Wolff was, in effect, isolated in a theatre of war that was collapsing around him. When Hitler's rage reached Wolff, it came not as a personal summons to Berlin, but as a written communication, a Führer directive ordering his arrest and execution. The message was clear. Wolff had attempted to negotiate the surrender of German forces without authorization. In Nazi law, in Nazi morality, in Nazi understanding of loyalty. This was equivalent to treason. The penalty was death. Wolff had hours, perhaps less, before the execution squad arrived. The man who had walked the corridors of power for over a decade, who had whispered in Himmler's ear and influenced the decisions of the Reich, was now a hunted man. The machinery he had helped build had turned on him. He was, at that moment, between worlds, no longer truly part of the Nazi hierarchy, but not yet fully committed to any alternative. What Wolff did next reveals something essential about his character and his understanding of the situation. He did not attempt to flee to the Allies. He did not try to escape to Switzerland or seek asylum with American forces. Instead, he did something far more audacious and revealing. He composed a message back to Hitler, not an apology, though it contained elements of that. Not a confession, though it contained elements of that as well. Rather, it was a careful, calculated explanation designed to convince the Führer that nothing substantive had been agreed, that the negotiations were exploratory only, and that Wolff's primary loyalty remained to the Nazi state. He claimed that he had been gathering intelligence on Allied intentions, testing their willingness to negotiate, all with an eye toward understanding what Germany might face in defeat. He suggested that his conversations with the OSS had been conducted as a form of advanced reconnaissance, not as betrayal. It is impossible to know how much of this explanation was true and how much was pure fabrication designed for survival. Historians and intelligence analysts remain divided on the question. What is certain is that it worked. Hitler, receiving the message through military channels, modified his order. Rather than immediate execution, Wolff was to be investigated. An SS court-martial was ordered. Wolff was stripped of some of his command authority, though notably, he retained influence over SS operations in Italy. The immediate death sentence was commuted to something less certain but still dangerous, the threat of future judgment, depending on how matters unfolded. In a regime where a Führer directive could mean death within hours, this was a reprieve, but it was also a threat that hung over Wolff's head for the remaining weeks of the war. During this precarious period, Wolff performed an extraordinary balancing act. He continued to maintain command of German SS forces in Italy. He continued to present himself as a loyal Nazi officer, issuing orders that conformed to Berlin's strategic directives. He continued to visit Wehrmacht and SS commanders, maintaining the appearance of authority and normalcy. Simultaneously, he continued his secret negotiations with the Americans through intermediaries. He communicated with Alan Dulles and other OSS representatives, continuing to discuss the terms for German surrender in Italy. He was, in those final weeks, operating on two parallel tracks that could not possibly coexist if either side discovered the full scope of the other's knowledge. It was an exhausting, terrifying, and ultimately unsustainable position. The records of Wolff's state of mind during this period are fragmentary and often self-serving, written after the war when he had every incentive to present himself in the best possible light. Yet certain patterns emerge from the accounts of those who knew him and the documents that survive. Wolff was afraid. He was no longer a man confident in his position or certain of his future. The ground beneath him had shifted fundamentally. He was also, by most accounts, acutely aware of the human cost of continued fighting. Italy in April 1945 was still witnessing battles, casualties, the destruction of cities, and the displacement of civilians. Every day that the war continued meant more death. Wolff was a man who had spent his career in the business of administration and organization, managing systems and hierarchies. Now he was confronted with a question that transcended administration. How many lives was his own survival worth? Himmler's parallel negotiations with Swedish contacts during this same period created an additional layer of complexity to Wolff's situation. Wolff was surely aware that his superior was exploring his own avenues for contacting the Allies. This knowledge must have been both reassuring and troubling. Reassuring because it suggested that even the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy were beginning to contemplate the unthinkable. Troubling because it meant that Wolff was not unique, not the only bridge between the collapsing Reich and the victorious Allies. His value was qualified by the fact that others possessed similar value. Himmler's initiatives also raised the question of whether Wolff was acting with his superior's knowledge and tacit consent, or whether he was genuinely operating on his own. The documents suggest that by April 1945, Himmler may have known of Wolff's activities and chosen not to stop them, even as he pursued his own parallel channels. Throughout the first half of April, Wolff maintained this impossible position. He issued orders to SS units that had little chance of being carried out. He coordinated with Wehrmacht commanders who were themselves beginning to make their own peace arrangements with the Allies. He sent messages to Berlin that were calculated to reassure a dying regime, while simultaneously telling American intelligence officers that German surrender in Italy was imminent and could happen within weeks if proper terms could be negotiated. He was a man living in fundamental contradiction, preserving his authority by pretending that authority still meant something, negotiating for surrender while maintaining the facade of continued resistance. He was between worlds in the most literal sense, no longer truly part of the Nazi system that was collapsing around him, but not yet committed to the alternative that the Allies represented. He was suspended in that terrible space where the old order was dying, but the new order had not yet fully taken shape. He was a Nazi officer negotiating for peace, a German commander preparing for defeat, a man who had built much of the machinery of horror, now trying to position himself for survival in the world that would emerge from that horror's ashes. The war in Europe was collapsing. In the first days of May 1945, the German Reich existed only as a geographic memory, fractured into zones of surrender and chaos. To the north, Soviet armies were already flowing into Berlin. American and British forces pushed from the west. In Italy, the front lines had stalled in the mountains, but everyone with eyes to see understood that the end was measured in days, not weeks. Karl Wolff, at his headquarters in northern Italy, stood at a threshold unlike any he had faced before. The game he had been playing since early 1944, the careful balance between loyalty to Berlin and secret negotiation with the Allies, suddenly demanded an answer. There could be no more delay. There could be no more ambiguity. The moment of choice had arrived, and with it came a clarity that was almost cruel in its simplicity. What happened next would determine not only how many soldiers and civilians would die in the Italian theatre, but also how history would judge the man who held the power to end it. On the 2nd of May, General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, the German commander of Army Group C in Italy, made a fateful decision. He had been in communication with Wolff for weeks, understanding the secret negotiations that had been unfolding through back channels in Switzerland. Vietinghoff was not a man inclined toward dramatic gestures or romantic notions of resistance. He was a professional soldier, a Prussian officer whose primary concern was the welfare of his troops and the avoidance of further pointless suffering. He authorized Wolff to proceed with surrender negotiations. This was not a dramatic rebellion against the Third Reich. It was something more pragmatic and, in its way, more significant. It was the decision of a military commander to prioritize the lives in his charge over abstract notions of loyalty to a regime that was already dead. Wolff moved with the precision of a man who had spent years managing complex military bureaucracies. He knew exactly whom to contact, exactly what to say, and exactly how to move through the remaining channels of authority without triggering the paranoid mechanisms of German command that still functioned, albeit barely, in the dying hours of the regime. The negotiations that followed unfolded across 3 locations simultaneously: northern Italy, Switzerland, and the American military headquarters in Europe. Alan Dulles, the OSS chief in Switzerland, who had been Wolff's primary contact throughout the long months of secret talks, was suddenly coordinating with American military commanders who actually held authority over occupation forces. This was no longer academic. This was no longer exploratory. This was the actual business of ending a war in a specific geographic theater. Dulles sent word through secure channels that German forces under Wolff's influence were prepared to surrender the entire Italian campaign without further resistance. The number of troops involved was substantial, roughly 300,000 German soldiers, plus tens of thousands of Italian fascist forces, though the exact accounting became a matter of dispute in the years that followed. These were not token forces. These were frontline combat units that could theoretically have retreated into the Alps for months of guerrilla warfare. They could have inflicted significant casualties. They could have destroyed the industrial infrastructure of northern Italy in a final spasm of Nazi ideology. Instead, they were prepared to lay down arms. The question was whether the Allied military command would respond quickly enough to make it happen before Berlin either countermanded the order or sent assassins to remove Wolff from the equation. The British commanders were suspicious. The Americans were cautious. Both were accustomed to German military deceptions and had no interest in being caught off guard by some elaborate trap or trick designed to buy time for Berlin. The negotiations moved through encrypted messages and careful language. Wolff was simultaneously communicating with both the Allies and with Himmler's organization in Berlin, maintaining the fiction that he remained a loyal Nazi servant while actually engineering the largest unauthorized surrender of German forces on any front since the war had turned against Germany. It was a performance of extraordinary complexity. He had to appear trustworthy to men who represented nations that were his enemies. He had to appear loyal to masters who, if they fully understood what he was doing, would have executed him without hesitation. He had to manage his own officers, many of whom were fanatical SS men who would die rather than accept defeat. And he had to do all of this while the ground beneath the entire German command structure was literally disintegrating. By the 4th of May, negotiations had progressed enough that American General Lyman Lemnitzer arrived in Switzerland to meet directly with German representatives. These were not theoretical discussions anymore. These were the actual terms of military surrender being negotiated in real time. The surrender document that emerged from these frantic negotiations specified that German forces in the Italian theater would cease all operations and lay down their weapons. The agreement called for the orderly disengagement of troops and the prevention of destruction of infrastructure. German forces were to withdraw to assembly points where they would be disarmed and processed as prisoners of war. Officers would retain their sidearms as a gesture toward military dignity. Enlisted men would be separated and held in accordance with Geneva Convention protocols, though everyone involved understood that the future treatment of German soldiers remained uncertain. The date set for the final surrender was the 2nd of May 1945, though in the chaotic nature of military communications in those final hours, the exact timing remained somewhat fluid. Wolff had to communicate this agreement back through secure channels to his subordinate commanders scattered across northern Italy. He had to coordinate with General Vietinghoff to ensure that the order would be obeyed. He had to do all of this while maintaining enough distance from the negotiations that if they failed or were discovered, he could maintain some form of plausible denial. The tension of those hours was almost unbearable. Any discovery by fanatical SS elements or Berlin could trigger immediate execution. Any failure in communication could cause units to continue fighting when the war was already over. Any breakdown in coordination could create confusion that might reignite combat operations. What actually happened in the final days of the war in Italy became immediately contested. According to the narrative that emerged, Wolff's negotiated surrender was executed smoothly, with German forces laying down weapons and withdrawing from combat positions with minimal additional casualties. The claim was made, and would be repeated consistently in the post-war years, that the early surrender prevented weeks or perhaps months of additional fighting in the Italian mountains. Lives that would have been lost in pointless combat were therefore saved by Wolff's actions. The number of lives saved was never precisely calculated, but estimates ranged from several thousand to tens of thousands, depending on which version of the story was being told. This became the redemptive narrative that Wolff would present to his Allied captors, to historians, and to the world. It was the argument that transformed him from a man who had been a senior administrator in the SS apparatus during the Holocaust into something approaching a pragmatist who, when given the opportunity, had used his position to end unnecessary suffering. The narrative was emotionally powerful and contained elements of truth. Early German surrender did prevent some additional combat deaths that would have occurred if fighting had continued through May and into June. But the historical record suggests a more complicated reality. The German military command in Italy was already in a state of near total collapse. The Italian campaign had become increasingly secondary to the main theatres of war. Reinforcements had largely ceased. The ability to conduct sustained military operations was already vanishing. Whether Wolff's negotiations accelerated the surrender by days or weeks, or whether they merely formalized a process that was already inevitable, remains a subject of genuine historical debate. Soldiers continued to die in the final days of fighting, even after the surrender date had been agreed upon, because not all units received the order immediately, and some fanatical elements refused to comply. The actual prevention of additional deaths through Wolff's actions was real, but difficult to quantify precisely. What is undeniable is that Wolff positioned himself as the man who had done this. He claimed credit for ending the war in Italy. He made himself the indispensable figure in the narrative of peace. And the Allies, now victorious and increasingly worried about the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe, found it convenient to accept and amplify that narrative. Wolff's position in those final days was extraordinarily dangerous, and he navigated it with the skills that had allowed him to survive the Third Reich. When Adolf Hitler learned of the negotiations, which happened through German intelligence channels just before the final surrender took effect, he reacted with characteristic fury. The Führer issued immediate orders for Wolff's arrest and execution. Wolff was to be shot as a traitor. The order never reached him in time, partly because the German command structure had already begun to decompose, and partly because Wolff had positioned himself within a command structure where he had sufficient autonomy that such orders could be delayed or intercepted. He was aware of Hitler's rage. He knew that his name was on a death warrant, and yet he remained in his position, completing the surrender, coordinating with the Allies, and ensuring that the agreement was implemented as smoothly as possible given the circumstances. It was a performance of ice-cold nerve, whether it was motivated by a desire to save lives, a desire to position himself favorably with the victorious powers, or some combination of both, remained something that only Wolff fully understood. The moment of actual German surrender in Italy arrived on the 7th of May, 1945, though the process continued to unfold over subsequent days as scattered units received orders and made their way to assembly points. Wolff was present for the formal ceremonies and the initial contacts between German and Allied commanders. He was photographed meeting with American generals. He was present at the moment when German soldiers began to lay down their weapons. He was there to receive the gratitude of both the military commanders and the political authorities who suddenly had responsibility for occupied Italy. In the immediate aftermath, Wolff began positioning himself as the man who had accomplished this miracle of peaceful conclusion. He cooperated fully with American occupation authorities. He provided information about SS operations, concentration camp locations, and Nazi administrative procedures. He made himself useful to the victorious powers in ways that suggested he had value beyond his role as a defeated military commander. He was not, at this moment, arrested or interned with other captured SS officers. He was treated as someone special, someone with whom the Americans might wish to maintain a useful relationship. The question of whether the surrender actually saved significant lives remained genuinely important, because it was the foundation upon which Wolff's entire post-war survival would be built. If the surrender had been merely a formality, a rubber stamp on a process that was already inevitable, then Wolff's claim to redemption was substantially weakened. If the surrender had prevented weeks of fighting in mountainous terrain where German forces might have inflicted significant casualties and suffered significant losses themselves, then the claim was stronger. The historical record suggests that the reality fell somewhere in between these extremes. The war in Italy was ending regardless of whether Wolff negotiated a formal surrender or not, but the manner in which it ended, the prevention of destruction and final desperate battles, the preservation of order in a moment of chaos, these things might in fact have prevented additional